Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, I would like to welcome everyone. My name is Leanne Tibbetts, and I will chair today's seminar. We are pleased to have representatives from a variety of agriculture organizations and community groups from across Manitoba registered. This validates the importance and timeliness of conversations about fundraising and fund development planning. Because of COVID-19, many organizations have had to shift and consider alternatives to their traditional fundraising approaches. Our goal today is to help you identify new fund development strategies that you can apply within your nonprofit space. The presenters will share current statistics and trends in the fund development sector, best practices and insights into traditional and virtual fundraising, as well as innovative concepts related to fund development planning. We hope this information will help you and your organization thrive. I would like to introduce Brady Josephson, Managing Director with Next After Institute for Online Fundraising. I had an opportunity to hear Brady present virtually a few months ago and instantly felt the need to bring his content and messaging to Manitoba organizations. He uses data, research, examples, and experience to share his message. Brady refers to himself as a charity nerd, an entrepreneur, a digital marketer, professor, and writer, and he is on a mission to see more people giving and more causes thriving. We know his presentation will stimulate questions. Please use the question feature on the right-hand panel, and he will respond to questions following his session. We are so pleased to have you with us today, Brady, to discuss current trends in fundraising and share your insights and content. I'll let you take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, Leanne, and thank you so much everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking about a lot of different data, a lot of what we're seeing in the world of online fundraising and fundraising overall. But I first have to say thank you. Thank you again for the work that you do. I work on the research side. I'm kind of behind screens and analyzing fundraising. I actually don't get to do that much fundraising now. I used to, not so much anymore. So the only way that I can really make an impact in this world is if you do the work that you do. So thank you very much. I also wanted to call out that this is a very unique connection for me to be speaking to Manitobans, but also the agricultural part of the government of Manitoba, because this is actually part of my story. So if we look at the map of Manitoba, if we zoom in here, over there on the Saskatchewan border, there is a little town called Benito. And that is actually where my great-grandfather Sven and my great-grandmother Christina settled when they came over from Sweden, and where my grandfather Albert was born. And he actually managed this farm. We went back there a few years ago for a family reunion. He managed this farm for a number of years. He ended up being a pastor and lived in Vancouver, but he would drive all the way across Canada every summer or every fall to be a part of the harvest and manage this farm. And he desperately wanted me to take it over. It wasn't really in my career path. So I said, unfortunately, I couldn't do it. I went down the nonprofit path, and my grandfather always said, hey, if you wanted to do nonprofit, you should have just been a farmer anyways. He absolutely loved that joke because he told me that pretty much all the time. So I have some roots in Manitoba. I was born in Saskatchewan, grew up in Alberta, went to school in Chicago, lived in Vancouver, and now I'm in Texas of all places. So we can talk about that later if we want. But here's where I want to go today. I want to talk about this problem that you and I and we all face when it comes to fundraising. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a model or an approach that I think is an effective way to get around that problem or solve that problem to some degree, particularly for online fundraising. I'm going to weave in a bunch of tips throughout, but specific to like multi-channel or integrated, so online and offline, things that you can do to raise funds, and then email fundraising, and I'll share why that's so important. And then hopefully we have a lot of time for questions and discussion, as Leanne mentioned. So please, please, please ask a bunch of questions. Hopefully we can get to them all. If not, I'll give you my contact information and we can take it offline or exchange emails and things like that. Again, I'm not going to walk through everything there is to do in fundraising. We can't do that, but you've got some other great panelists and sessions that I'm sure will cover other parts of fundraising that I won't. I'm really looking for, ideas and inspiration and tips for you. Again, you'll get the slides, so don't worry about writing down some of the stats. You'll get them later. Focus on things that you can do. I encourage you to write things down and then think about what's one thing that you will take away from this. And I'm going to focus as much as I can on Canadian data. Unfortunately, the US has a lot more data, and that's the work that I'm doing now. But I'll try to make this as Canadian as possible. What we've seen is the really main difference between Canada and US is messaging, not so much tactics. It's obviously, we talk a little bit different in Canada to Canadians, but the tactics are pretty much the same that we've seen working across the borders. And there's my contact information. Again, I'll share it again later if you want to get in touch. So that's where I want to head today. But first, let's start with a quiz. So this is a lot easier to do if we're in person. You know, we can do raise hands, or you can, you know, like yell things out. So this is gonna be on the honor system here. I'm gonna show you real fundraising experiments. I'm gonna show you an option A and an option B. And maybe you can throw it in the chat, or maybe just on your piece of paper, or you can raise your own hand and no one will see you, but I trust that you'll do that. I want you to guess or think which one of these two options raise more money. So for example, this is a fundraising email. You've got option A on the left and option B on the right. The only difference, the copy or the text is the exact same. The only difference is some design changes. You can see there's less design in option A versus option B. So which do you think raised more money, option A or option B? Again, honor system, jot it down, raise your hand even though we can't see you. All right, I'm gonna show you another one. This is a donation page now. We've got option A, option B, same layout, the form's the same. Option A just has about 5 paragraphs of copy and text, versus B doesn't have that. It has just the one line before you get to the donation form. So which do you think raised more money, option A or option B? Option A or option B? I'll give you the results in about a minute or so. This is one of our oldest experiments. These are 4 Chris's with very minor differences, right? We've got Hemsworth, Pratt, Evans, and Pine. Which do you think is the best Chris? A, B, C, or D? Honor system here, A, B, C, or D. It's one of our favorite experiments, typically. A, B, C, or D. Here's another real fundraising experiment. This is an email. You can see that option A is a lot shorter than option B. Option A has about 550 words, whereas option B has actually 2,200 words, which is about the same length as some of the papers I wrote in grad school. But which do you think raised more money, option A or option B? Chat it, raise your hand, honor system. And then last one, this is a fundraising campaign where you go from email to donation page. This is how a lot of online fundraising is done. The only difference between these two treatments, or these two options here, is one has a video. You can see it has a video both in the email, and then on the landing page, the donation page that it points to, it also has a video. That's the only difference between these two. So A or B, video, or sorry, no video A or video B. Which do you think raised more money? All right, now I'm going to show you the answers. So how'd y'all do? This is probably the best part about living in Texas now, is I get to say y'all. It's such a handy word. I like to say it all the time. So, you know, how'd y'all do? Let's find out. Experiment 1, email. By actually removing a bunch of design elements, they saw 112.5% increase in donations. In the donation page example, by actually having 5 paragraphs of copy or text on the donation page, they saw 150% increase in the likelihood of someone making a donation. This is a trick question. It's actually Ryan Gosling. He's 200% more awesome than those other ones. Plus he's Canadian, so special win for us. On this fundraising email one, the 2,200 word email actually raised 106.3% more donations, more revenue than the shorter email. And in this case, using a video actually increased clicks rate, the number of people that clicked on the email. But when we're fundraising, we care more about donations, and having the video actually decreased donations 81%. So how'd y'all do? Did you get them all right? Did you get them all wrong? Or maybe a better question is, how'd you decide? How'd you choose which one? Did you kind of go off gut instinct? Did you kind of go off what you think you would do, or what you do when it comes to your own marketing and fundraising? But when it comes to guessing or predicting donor behavior, the reality is y'all don't know. But neither do I. This is what I get to do for a living, is try to look at experiments and try to understand why donors do what they do. And you and I, as marketers and fundraisers, we are terrible at doing this. We know too much. We're in it too deep. It's hard to understand a world in which we don't actually live in anymore. But here's the funny thing is, every single one of you is a donor. And we as donors are also terrible at predicting our own behavior, or what we think we would do. This is why donor surveys are really, really tough to trust, because we don't know what we actually do or why we think we did certain things. And this is because so much of our decision making happens at a subconscious level. So according to this research here, they're talking about our subconscious brain cranking out 11 million bits of information each and every second, taking in all this information, whereas our conscious mind can only process about 16 to 50 bits of information, which means our like more logical, rational conscious mind is so much slower. But also, when we make these snap decisions, we have a hard time articulating why. So then what does this mean when it comes to our fundraising? We like to say that fundraisers are from Mars and donors are from Venus. We're caring about the same thing, in this case giving, but we're coming at it from very, very different perspectives. And if we are not attuned or don't understand the donors that we're trying to communicate with, this gap starts to widen and exist between what we are saying and what we want, and even what donors want, but what they're hearing. It's not quite the same thing. There's this thing called the curse of knowledge, where once you know a piece of information, it's almost impossible to imagine a world where you do not know that information. And so it takes a lot of effort for us to understand our donors. And this is the fundamental problem that we have when it comes to fundraising. And now, just to give you a glimpse at how big this problem is, a couple data points. When we look at charitable giving in Canada over the past 20 or so years, it looks pretty good, right? Look at how much we've gone from, $4.5 billion to now over 10 billion in the latest release from Statistics Canada. So that's good. But when we start breaking it down to the average donation amount, when we kind of hold income constant, we see it's more like flat. So kind of over the last 20 years, where people are about the same in terms of their generosity, going back almost 20 years. And then this is what's most damaging and critical is when we look at the number of tax filers in Canada. Now, just because you didn't file tax doesn't necessarily mean you're not giving to a charity, or you could be supporting nonprofits, but still the percent of people that are actively participating in the charitable construct that we have in Canada has been going down and down and down and down each year for the past 20 years, which means we're not really growing giving. There's just fewer Canadians giving more. And that is very, very concerning. We see the same trend in the US, actually. When we look to the future of giving and philanthropy, this is actually a very, very worrying trend, especially when you add in that there's more Canadians who seemingly care more than ever before. This means that you and I and we are getting worse at turning people's natural compassion and care into conversions and contributions. This is a very big problem that the generosity of larger, older donors are kind of paving the cracks. So that's like the bad scenario. The rest of the time I want to talk about, well, what we can do. And I think an underpinning of fundraising success is this idea of empathy. Empathy, something that is kind of in short supply nowadays. I mean, we just went through an election, which we don't need to talk about, but empathy is really kind of sorely lacking in society. But when we talk about fundraising, we often talk about empathy in this kind of construct, where we're trying to evoke an emotion. We're trying to elicit a feeling from someone. And there's actually a physiological side of this, where once people feel something, have this more positive reaction, we actually release oxytocin, and oxytocin has been directly linked with generosity. They've actually injected people with oxytocin, which I don't know how you do that, but then they were able to predict 80% of the time how generous that person would be simply based on their oxytocin levels. Now, there is something about narrative structure and storytelling and connecting to humans that we can do in fundraising. But what I'm really talking about is this more understanding, true understanding, not just evoking a feeling. It's something that I've been learning a lot about since I've become a dad. This is my son, Hendrix. He's a little bit older now. This was last year when he went to his first baseball game in Chicago. Note the White Sox, not the Cubs. And that's him taking some of his few steps in shoes that are much too big. So I think any parent, if you have the joy of having kids, you develop a sense of empathy pretty quick for maybe your partner, but also your kids. But this is particularly true for my wife and I, because we actually adopted Hendrix when he was 11 days old. And if you know anyone who's been through the adoption process or have gone through it yourself, it's basically a big old exercise in empathy. Empathy for my wife and partner about what it's like to not be able to have kids, and we don't exactly know why, but we couldn't, so we each have to have empathy with each other. But we actually had to go through courses and learn how to be parents, which is funny. You know, if you adopt, you have to get certified. If you just get knocked up, you just have a kid and go on your way. It's kind of interesting. But we actually did this exercise where we went around the room and talked about what does it mean to be an adoptive parent or go through this adoption process from everyone's different perspectives. So birth mother's parents, my extended family, even my colleagues and coworkers, things like, baby showers that they couldn't do. And this kind of odd, do we celebrate or not? Do you have a kid or do you not? Just these little things that when you're in it, you don't really think about until you step outside and try to think intentionally about each and every single person's perspective. This is the empathy that we need to have in our fundraising. It goes beyond feeling into truly understanding. If we don't understand donors, why they do the things that they do, not just say why they do the things that they do, then this gap will continue to widen. So this is where empathy is absolutely critical. And then you might be saying, well, that's great, but what do we do? And this is actually where I think data has a critical role to play. Now, data can kind of, be overwhelming perhaps, and we have so much of it, but I'll try to break down and make it hopefully a little bit more accessible. And this is really what we do at the Next Chapter Institute that I lead up, where our mission is to decode what works in fundraising and then make it as accessible as we can to as many charities as we can across the world, where we do research, essentially collect and analyze data to develop empathy for donors. So we did this study that I'll reference a few times in Canada a few years ago, where we actually became a donor and an email subscriber to 152 Canadian charities ourselves. And then we looked at all the web pages we had to go through for email sign up and donation. We tracked over 1,200 emails over a 3-month period and looked at them and analyzed them. We kind of scored and classified the email sign up, the email fundraising, and the online giving experience to create this research study. Now we're trying to help nonprofits, but selfishly, we're just trying to understand what is it like to be a donor in Canada, not just to one charity, but many charities, because most donors are not just a donor to your cause, they're a donor to multiple charities. The younger generations on average support 12 different causes. You're not the only one that they're giving to, so they get different types of communication. So that's what we're trying to understand. What's the giving experience like? What's the communications like? But also, what are organizations doing or not doing when it comes to communicating and connecting with their donors? This is one kind of data point that we're trying to collect to develop this sense of empathy and share our experience with you or anyone else who wants to read it. So data can be very complicated, very overwhelming. I'm a fairly simple guy. I'm really not very smart. So for me, data simply breaks down into 2 camps. One camp is proof. This data is more like historical looking, and this proves that something that had occurred. And the other side is insights. Data can provide insights into something that could be true in the future. Pretty much all different types of data points, both soft and hard data, gets broken up into these 2 camps, proof and insights. So I'll kind of walk through this a little bit more. So insights, these can come from anywhere, anyone, at any time. And this can often be kind of a research study or a data point. So for example, one of the data points that we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is when we look at where do donors give, and we put them into 4 buckets or donor cohorts: people who only give online, people who only write checks, people who only give offline but receive email, or people who give both online and offline, or a multi-channel donor. We found that people who will only ever write you a check just by getting emails, even if they never give online, just by getting emails, give 84% more than those who do not get emails, and are 30% more likely to give year over year. Just by receiving emails. They will never show up as an online donor, but getting emails while they write you checks, they're more generous, more likely to give year over year. That's a data insight. So this then leads to strategy. You should be getting and sending more emails. Even if these folks aren't giving online, this is one way to increase offline giving. And this is where email is so critical. Just want to take a moment to share how critical email is. It's when we look across all of our data and research, email is the most important driver of online fundraising. Again, don't just trust me. Look at some of the data. We looked at 73 different organizations and their detailed, cleaned Google Analytics data. And we look in aggregate, where do donations come from in terms of channel? We see that email is the highest revenue per channel outside of direct. And direct is normally just not tagging links properly. So when we look at like properly tagged links, it's email. And we look across like a health organization, email drives 199% more revenue than direct, or a higher ed organization, 739% more revenue than the next highest, or public policy, 421% higher revenue than direct traffic. Email generates revenue, but why? Well, again, when we look at some of the data, we look at this metric called conversion rate, the number of people who take an action versus the number of people who say visit a page, and we can break them out by channel in terms of where did they come from. And this is really what makes email such a big driver of revenue, is it has such a high conversion rate. Now, 4.67 may seem like a pretty low number, but when you compare it to, say, the next highest referral, it's 160% higher in terms of its ability to convert people into becoming donors. Plus, it's a bit of a renewable resource, right? You control the email, you can personalize the email, you control when you send, who you send, how often you send. It's a channel that you have a lot of control over, as opposed to some of the other channels potentially, like referral or organic search in particular. So it's a high conversion, high revenue driver, and it's extremely important today. Think about this world where we can't meet in person, right? The value of online communications has gone up, and we know this again because of some data. So when COVID first struck, we started analyzing and showcasing some of our benchmark data along with Canada Helps to try and shed some light on what's really going on to help all Canadian charities. So we started tracking and sharing the emails we received, and then worked with Canada Helps on the online giving side. And here's what we saw through the first 2 quarters. As you can see that already before COVID actually struck there in March, overall giving was going up. It was actually 2019 online giving had already grown 17%. And in those first few months, you can see how 2020 was already starting to grow on 2019. But then once COVID hit, look at how much online revenue started to grow and grow. Now, we don't know how much of this is just kind of like a true lift and how much of this is just shifting from other channels, but we definitely know that online giving was growing at about 10 to 20% year over year. This year, it should probably be more like 20 or 30% and even higher on mobile, which was 20 to 30% already, could be closer to 40% this year in terms of growth rate. And it wasn't just across one part of the country or one vertical. This was every single vertical, every single province and territory. There you are right there, Manitoba. Saw a sharp increase in online giving. We don't have the data for this last quarter in Canada, but we do in the US, and we continue to see this trend where online giving continues to grow even as COVID sets in and the economy isn't doing quite as great. So again, why did online revenue go up during this time, this tough, difficult time? One of the reasons is email volume went up. When we look at email volume by sender, you can see in the same time period, the first 2 quarters, Canadian charities started to send more and more emails. Generally speaking, when you send more email, you raise more money. And what's interesting is these weren't more ask emails. So this chart here is looking at the green, which was an ask email, the blue, which was a newsletter, and the gray is everything else. And other than the 1 week in early May around Giving Tuesday now, the ratio of ask emails stayed pretty constant throughout this time period. So it's not like charities were asking more, they were just communicating more. And again, generally speaking, the more we communicate, particularly good communications, even if we don't ask, it generally leads to more revenue. And the other thing that was kind of fueling this is like less tactical, more just interesting as a charity nerd. In Canada, you can see here the 2 bars between 2019 and 2020 in terms of average gift or generosity. It's a measure of how generous people are. And you can see that in the first all the way through April there, Canadians were a lot more generous in 2020 than they were in 2019. This is often what we don't see when pandemics hit or global crises or economic crises. People normally give less, but give more frequently. And in Canada, we actually saw the opposite to start, where people were giving more, kind of responding to the call, and maybe some people were hesitant to give. And then in months May and June, it started to go back to kind of what a normal response would be to an economic crisis, where generosity started going down a little bit, but people were giving more frequently, which still led to more online giving. So just kind of an interesting aside from the data there. But email is critical in terms of driving revenue all the time, but particularly in a pandemic, and particularly the time period that we're about to enter here at year end. So we define year end as November 15th through December 31st. And when we analyze the data and where revenue comes from, we see this pretty consistent pattern. We call it the year end revenue curve, where you see it like this little bump around Giving Tuesday, and then December a lot of money, and then a disproportionate amount of funds come in online in the last 3 days and the last day in particular. You can see that 15.5% of all revenue given in this time period, which is already normally 30 to 40% of an organization's revenue, comes in on one day at the very end. Hugely, hugely important day of giving. But again, it's not just how do we get revenue, but where does it come from? So again, if we look at where does revenue come from all year, this is this chart, versus just year end, November 15th through December 31st, versus just December 31st, we can see a couple interesting things. One, when you look at search, so people that are actively searching and either seeing an ad or just organically finding a website, it goes from about 32% of donations to 39% to 43%. So this idea of, wow, do people really care about year-end giving? Are they really motivated to give? Yes. I mean, not only do we see a big spike in giving, but we see a big spike in search traffic where people are actively looking for charities and causes and nonprofits in a way to give at year-end. This is part of the reason why we have to be prepared and do year-end fundraising. But the other interesting thing is look at how much more valuable email is compared to other channels, particularly channels in your control. So things like paid search or social ads or something like that. Again, email is incredibly valuable, but especially at year end. And just to nail this point home about how critical email is, it's also hugely important for boomers. So this group, Domain 3, did some research about like what do boomers do, and they saw the number 2 thing that boomers want to do is use email when it comes to online. Now I might be saying like, boomers are kind of boring, like who wants to market to this Yahoo, right? It's actually my dad. He's actually visiting right now and looking after my son. But this is actually a massive opportunity is to focus on folks like my dad or boomers and up with online strategies. And again, one thing is when we look at where does revenue come from in Canada, 41% of giving in Canada comes from boomers. And when we toss in civics, 60% of all giving comes from boomers and up. And if we look at an even more demographic breakdown from Statistics Canada, basically the older you are, the more generous you are. Look at that, straight down the line, 65, 55, 45, 35, 25. Now you might be saying, well, what about online? This is what's so crazy is we see the exact same thing when it comes to online giving. So these folks said, hey, the silent generation, 75 plus, gives more online donations than any other generation. And I saw this, I was like, no way, this can't be true. This is, I know older people give, but this is crazy. They're not talking about revenue or generosity, they're talking about transactions or number of gifts. So I said, take off. Normally I have a picture of Strange Brew, but no Americans really get it. So I took out the picture of Strange Brew. You'd probably get it. Anyways, take off. I can't believe that. Again, look at some data. When we analyzed over $20 million of online transactions, sure enough, we found that 47% came from 65 plus. And when we add 55 plus, 72%, almost 3/4 of all online transactions came from people 55 plus. And again, here's the Google Analytics, 65, 55, 45, 35, 25. 65, 55, 45, 35, 25. 65, 55, 45. This is the rest of my presentation, just saying numbers all the way down. This is true. So the idea for online fundraising, at least based on data, is not only do boomers and up give, they give online, and they're also under targeted. It's kind of not sexy. In the States here, the AARP estimates only about 5 to 10% of marketing budget is spent on boomers. They are under marketed to and disproportionately generous. So hopefully those are some maybe unique things or maybe like eye-opening stats, but also leads to strategies. How do we target boomers and up for giving? Not that the younger generation isn't important, but they're kind of not important right now. But data isn't the only source of insights. It's not like we can only pull from data when we have these types of stats. There's other ways that we can develop innovation or get ideas. These three researchers and authors, Jeff, Hal, and Clayton and Christensen, wrote The Innovator's Dilemma. Years ago, wrote this case study for Harvard Business where they took 6 years to look at the most innovative CEOs and tried to figure out like what made these folks so innovative, or how did they grow their companies so well? What was the skills that they possessed? And the number one thing they found was this skill called associating, or this idea to translate ideas from one arena to another. They called it the kind of the backbone skill. And then there was these supplementary skills like questioning and networking and observing that all kind of work together. And not all of these things were like innate, like these are skills that we can all learn, and they all kind of work together to lead to new ideas or breakthrough ideas. And so a case study for you, something close to my heart, is this. Y'all know what this is? If you said a vacuum, you're wrong. It's not a vacuum. This is a Dyson. Very different. So years ago, I was pretty early married. I remember I asked my wife, like, hey, you know, what do you think you want for your anniversary? And she said, oh, I would really like a Dyson vacuum. I was like, I'm pretty sure that's a trap. You know, I'm not the smartest man in the world, but you don't buy your wife a vacuum for your anniversary. I came to find out she absolutely did want this vacuum, and they are awesome. Very expensive. But James Dyson, the inventor of Dyson, who's an engineer, his first model that hit the market in the 80s looked something like this. So, you know, not too different. The new one looks a little more, you know, space agey, but it wasn't just like a linear projection, progress. He didn't just wake up and invent this vacuum. He got the idea for this vacuum, which uses a centrifugal force, because he was so frustrated using this vacuum. If you ever used, you know, this vacuum back in the day, they sucked. Ooh, it's a cheap pun. They weren't very good, right? They used all these bags. They kept getting clogged. You had to get all these bags. He was just frustrated. He said, this is a terrible way to do cleanup. Let me invent a better vacuum, and invented something that used centrifugal force. Now, he got the idea for using centrifugal force as a cleaning mechanism actually from a sawmill, where he saw how sawmills were cleaning up mass amounts of sawdust using this kind of high-powered centrifugal force type vacuum system for their warehouses and for their shops and factories. Now, I was like, what is he doing in a sawmill? Well, he was actually producing wheelbarrows, and instead of using paint like everyone else did that kind of chipped, he said, well, I'm going to use this fusion epoxy, which kind of lasts longer. The downside is coating these wheelbarrows with this fusion epoxy was a nightmare, super big mess. And he was spending all this time cleaning it up. So then he's like, where can I find out how to do better cleanup? Oh, let's look at some sawmills. He tells a story about actually climbing the fence and sneaking into the sawmill to figure out how they were cleaning up their shop. And you might be saying, this vacuum guy, how is he making wheelbarrows? Well, again, he was using a wheelbarrow in his backyard. He's from the UK. a lot of rain, that single wheel, and he was frustrated again, just like, this wheelbarrow sucks. It keeps getting stuck in the mud, so he invented this thing called the ball barrel, which instead of using a wheel actually uses a ball that distributes weight more evenly so it doesn't get stuck in the mud. So you can see how him inventing this vacuum and becoming a billionaire in the process came from this series of ideas that he encountered and things that he tried. This is a great example of kind of innovation and its nonlinear progression, but associating seemingly unrelated ideas and transferring them, questioning why does this wheelbarrow only have one wheel? Why are wheelbarrows painted with paint that chips? You know, why do we have to use these bags in vacuums, right? He's questioning, he's observing his own experience. This wheelbarrow isn't very good. This vacuum isn't very good. Observing himself. And networking, this is a bit of a stretch. This is where we like kind of go outside of our industry. So I'm going to say he networked with the sawmill industry, even though it was more like, you know, corporate espionage. But he's using these skills to invent this vacuum, and you can see it uses elements of the ball to rotate, elements of the centrifugal force to get rid of the bags in the vacuum. This is an example of using different insights from seemingly unrelated areas to optimize and improve and develop products and innovations. It's a skill, it's something that takes effort and work. We can all do it, but we have to be curious. One of the things that I've observed in the nonprofit and charitable space is we often spend too much time trying to get to best practice and not enough time trying to understand why that's best practice, or is best practice even good, right? Getting to best practice isn't like the end destination. At best, it's a starting point to say, how can we get better from here? So many times it's just like, well, how do we just do what other organizations are doing? And that's okay, but we need to be more curious about what is driving results and how do we understand it. So this is a few data-based insights, is focus on getting and sending emails, even to offline only donors. It leads to offline revenue that you'll never see, and focus fundraising efforts on boomers and up, definitely offline, but especially online where they're often underserved. So that's an example of how we can use data to generate insights, but we also need to look at how do we generate our own proof. Just because it worked for someone else doesn't mean that it'll necessarily work for you. So proof, it should be yours. This should be kind of your data. It should start with very defined goals and tracked inputs. This is kind of basic principles about good data collection, but don't borrow someone else's proof that it works, even ours, right? We're just generating insights and suggestions. So first, this should be yours. You know, one of the things that we'll often run into is like, ooh, but Charity Water does this, you know, or name, you know, sexy organization in Canada that you admire. And that's great. That can be a good source of insights. I will tell you, I've been to a Charity Water gala. I've talked to their team a few times. I can almost guarantee you your donor base and organizational makeup is not the same as theirs. Unless you're, you know, really big with like 30-year-old hipsters in Brooklyn, you probably have a different type of donor base. Therefore, you probably need to communicate in slightly different ways. It isn't to say they don't do some great things. Their commitment to transparency and storytelling and impact reporting is amazing. But don't just assume that because it works for Charity Water, it will work for you. You and your donors are different than them and their donors. Borrow insights. Don't take it as proof or gospel. The other thing that we need to have is we need to have some clearly defined goals before we actually look at measuring. If you think back to this experiment as part of the quiz, if all you were doing was trying to figure out how do we get more clicks in this campaign, you'd think we gave them an email and we saw success. Whereas if your goal is donations, then this thing was a total failure. 81% decrease in donations. I shouldn't say total failure because you always learn no matter what happens. But oftentimes we can set a goal, and this happens all the time in fundraising. You set a fundraising goal, you do this event, you do this campaign, it didn't really work, and then there'll be some kind of, well, we raised a lot of awareness though. Well, was awareness your goal, or were you trying to raise money? Raising awareness is great, and if that's your goal, say our awareness is our goal, and then how are you going to measure it and go achieve that goal? But often we can reverse engineer. If you've heard this expression, if you torture data long enough, you can make it say anything. This is a cartoon that I had created because I love that expression. It's not, you know, super great. It took quite a few iterations to kind of get there, but it's a lot better than the first version that the person sent me, which was dark. You know, look at data. It's like dripping blood. These like henchmen are like beating data with the stick. I was like, oh, that's not quite the vibe I was going for. So the key point here is, you know, hire your cartoonists from the Philippines carefully and give them better direction. No, the idea is here, when it comes to proof, you have to have very clear, specific stated targets before the year, before the campaign, before the project. It sounds so simple, but I tell you what, if we don't have clearly set goals, then we'll often start chasing the wrong things. And then the last thing we need for proof is to track the inputs. So benchmark reports, data on the backside, how do we do this year? Those things are all fine. But it's hard to deliver or derive what caused it. This is part of the reason why we spend so much time understanding the giving experience. Is there's data that will tell you, how much people give online. I've shared different types of data, but if we don't know the inputs, then we don't truly understand the output, and then it gets hard to replicate. So the reason why I ended up going to the States is I ended up playing baseball. You can tell by the packed stadium I was playing in front of. It was a small college in Chicago, and I really wasn't very good. I'd hit one home run each year, and it was basically an accident because I didn't know why or what I did to actually hit the home run. I remember like the peak moment of my college career. I hit a 2-run pinch hit home run in the bottom of the 8th to tie a game with our season on the line. No idea what the pitch is to this day, no idea. So if you don't know what you did to influence the result, how can you then influence the result consistently? And this is what we run into in fundraising. Folks at the Science of Philanthropy Initiative actually did a survey of nonprofit organizations and said, hey, how often are you evaluating the fundraising methods and if they work or not? And 71% of organizations never or only occasionally evaluate their fundraising methods. Only 25% or so used any form of scientific-based research in a 5-year time period to understand what works. So going back to that problem where fewer and fewer Canadians are giving, that's because we don't know what works. We have to know and track what we did so we can understand what works and repeat that or avoid that. If you don't track inputs, plans, processes, what you're actually doing, if all you look at is outputs, we are going to be in a tough situation where we do not understand what is actually happening. So it's not just getting data as proof. There's a process to getting it. And this is why I think a big missing link in our use of data is an absence of testing. We can talk a lot in the question and answer period about testing and how to do it and sample size and all these different types of things. But fundamentally, when you go to test, there are these kind of like 8 basic steps. These are our 8 steps. If you read other guides or other people, there's slight variations. But you can see in here, identify the goal, make sure you can measure it, craft a hypothesis, calculate sample size, design a treatment, set up the experiment, validate the results, document your learning. Ingrained in testing are some of these things that you need to get good data. Clearly state your goal, clearly have a hypothesis or the input that you're going to do. Get the data that you need and then learn from it, document it and share your results. So one example of kind of going through a test, there's this book called The Science of Giving that we use in the graduate course that I teach occasionally, and it's full of 14 chapters of different like PhD level research. And one of them was a study in public radio in the US that was doing a telephone campaign, and what they would do is they'd say, hi, the person before you gave $75, would you consider making a gift? And then they'd go to another group and say, the person before you gave $180, would you consider giving? And the person before you gave $300, would you consider giving? And they measured the response against the control, which was, you weren't told that someone before you had given. And here's what they saw. Just by citing that the person before you, that random stranger that you don't know and you don't know if this is actually true, gave $300, increased response or average gift 29%. This is like an example of social proof for how connected and wired we are socially. So that's kind of like, an insight when we make donations and capture the experience. We see a lot of organizations that are trying to leverage this, right? Most people are giving 75, most people are giving 100, and then they default you down to those amounts, 75 and 100. So again, that's interesting. There's some science and research behind it. Some organizations are doing it, but we still don't know if this actually works. And this is why testing and experimentation is so critical. So this organization saw the same thing. It's actually a client of ours. And so we said, well, does this work? Let's put it to the test. So in this test, you can see the only difference between the donation page and form here was this middle donation amount that they highlighted with that star and said most popular. It's the only difference between these two. They saw an 8% increase in giving, a 15% increase in generosity, which means almost a 24% increase in total revenue, just by adding that one little thing to help people just make the decision of how much to give a little bit easier, particularly for people on a mobile device, where people are moving even quicker. Having something pre-selected with a little social proof had an even bigger impact, where 44% increase of people on a mobile device. Now again, testing's great because now we kind of track the input, see the output, we have some data, we know that this works. But if we're doing testing really well and the goal isn't to just get a result, but to understand people, now we can think, well, what else could we do? Even on this page, we could change the donation amount. We could talk about, instead of most popular right now, we could add text under the $50 donation button and say how many people maybe have given in the past week, month, or year. There's all these different little things that we can add now that we know that this concept kind of works. And not only that, but how else can you apply this to fundraising? If you're selling tickets to a gala, if you're sending a piece out in the mail, can we use the same type of concept in terms of most popular and pre-selection to influence other ways of giving? This is where we're trying to not just get results, but understand human behavior. And this is that last skill that they found for truly innovative CEOs, is experimenting. So going back to James Dyson, moving from that kind of early model or prototype in the 80s, in the 70s, to the model that he actually put into market in the 80s, how many iterations do you think it took him to end up with the vacuum that he ended up with? 5,127 iterations over 15 years, tinkering and tweaking to try to figure out what is it that works. Now, I'm not suggesting that it'll take 15 years and 5,000 iterations to better understand donors, but it's not like we can just run one test and we've solved the world's problems and truly know donors. This is a piece of our culture that has to be ingrained in our organizations, even on a small scale, is saying, what do we think in terms of hypothesis? How do we go and track it, get some proof, generate some insights? This type of model, I think, is incredibly critical to not just generating online fundraising results, but to better empathize with the donors, understand what they do, so that we can grow giving. This is basically a build, measure, learn model. So if you've familiar with agile methodology, or you've studied tech companies, this is a very, very common approach of saying, instead of taking all this time and guesswork in terms of what will work, let's just build something, give it to donors or people to interact with, measure, learn from it, and around we go. So that's kind of like the model at play. I want to apply this very specifically to say multi-channel fundraising and then email, and then we'll get into some questions. So, people who give offline are 84% more valuable than those who don't get emails, right? We kind of showed this earlier. And this is where a lot of the early days of integrated fundraising started, is kind of how do we say the same thing to our donors across all these different channels: social media, email, web, mail, telephone, face-to-face. Same message. And that's fine. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But each channel has some different components. For example, like there's cost, emails, and we have some different elements of personalization in here. So instead of saying the same thing across all channels, how do these channels influence one another? So when we look at how does, say, email affect mail, we already show that people who just receive email are more beneficial, or they're more worth, they give more. When we look at, well, how do you do this? This is what we do with our clients. It's 2 to 3 weeks before they get a direct mail appeal. We send them an email thanking them for past giving, maybe a report or saying, hey, here's what your donation has accomplished this past year. And then we know they're actually going to get something in the mail. So on the mail drop date, there's a soft ask that really says, just a heads up, you should be receiving a letter in the mail asking you for this. And there's a very, very soft ask, but generally speaking, we just want them to open the mail and respond in the mail, where they're probably going to give more. Then 10 days after that, this is a harder ask via email, where we kind of remind them that they received an email, remind them that they received the mail, and then we move towards a harder ask. And then after the campaign, if they've given, then that's for sure where we thank and try to close the loop and say, here's how your donation has been or will be used. That's kind of our methodology around mailing or emailing direct mail folks. But how else can we influence the offline with the online? So we know that there's some impact. So what can we use? Can we use social media, for example, to influence the offline? So this is a Canadian charity who is doing direct mail fundraising. And they said, well, what if we showed Facebook ads to people that were receiving a direct mail appeal? So they showed non-ask Facebook ads 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after or so. When they'd received the mail, they spent $690 and raised $10,000 more, 25% increase in revenue from people just seeing Facebook ads and giving through the mail. And again, these Facebook ads did not ask for a donation. That's critical. I'll come back to that. Well, that's impressive. How else can we influence like online giving with other online channels? Can we use something like social media to influence email? In this case, this organization had a 5 email welcome series once someone signed up for email. And they said, well, what if we showed those folks some Facebook ads that did not necessarily ask for money? And they saw a huge increase in the likelihood of someone giving and a decrease in the time it took for someone to make a gift. And again, these ads were not focused on giving. So what about using something like email to influence website? So this organization was saying, hey, you know what, we ask our donors a lot, like 3 times more than we don't ask. And we see low engagement rates. What if we didn't ask so much, but we just communicated more? So for a 3-month time period, they sent 1 more email a week that didn't ask for money, but just communicated, said, here's a blog post you might be interested in, here's a new news story, a resource. They saw an increase in email engagement, opens and clicks, 80%, an increase in donors, 8.1%, and an increase in revenue, 21%. One of the biggest variables or biggest things that helps grow fundraising isn't how much we ask, it's actually how much and how quality, how good our communications are to donors, even if they don't ask. And again, this email was not asking. And last example, how can we use the web to influence the web here? This organization created blog post content in this year-end season, again, where we know people are more likely to give or looking to give. They just created blog post content that said, hey, your donation makes a difference. Your support for organization is critical. Here's how we're having an impact or what your donation will do. And they were able to actually track people who saw those blog posts versus people who didn't, and saw almost a 200% increase from people who read those types of blog posts. And again, these articles were not asking for donations. It was simply creating content that people would read and they would give and transact in another medium or time. So again, all these different examples were not asking for money. The kind of behavioral economic principle behind this is something called priming, where we communicate and kind of try to evoke a stimulus of sorts that then we call back about 2 or 3 weeks later is what we found. So again, we're kind of priming someone to just see or be top of mind. So when we ask through the mail or email, they may not even be able to tell you that they saw a Facebook ad or read those blog posts, but we left an impression in their mind, which made it more likely for them to respond. But it also shows the power of content communications and cultivation. Something we're spending a lot more time researching because it's so critically important, not just to giving, but donor retention and repeat giving and lifetime value. These really, really critical things for sustaining fundraising has less to do about our fundraising and more to do about our communications. It's hugely, hugely important. So if you want to try some of these priming strategies, maybe you send emails to offline donors, you know, like in general, but particularly before and after an appeal. A little bit more advanced, but maybe you can show Facebook ads to direct mail recipients, again, a couple weeks before and after the appeal. If you have a new subscriber series, and I suggest that you do, maybe you can show Facebook ads to them, or maybe just new emails or new donors, you can show them Facebook ads. Send more cultivation in general, but especially to new donors. The most likely time a new donor is to make a second gift or become a recurring donor is actually within the first 30 to 45 days after their first gift. It's counterintuitive. It may seem like, oh, they just gave, you know, it's kind of like leave them alone and just thank them. And for sure, we should be thanking them, but here's when they're engaged. This is when we should be communicating to them, thanking them, saying, here's how your donation will be used. And yes, potentially moving to an ask instead of, let's leave them alone for 3 months and then maybe we come back. And by that point, they're gone. They don't remember you maybe. They've moved on. Front-loading communications or rapid donor cultivation is really, really critical. And just creating more kind of impact-focused content, report-focused content throughout the year is really, really critical as well. So again, this is how we can kind of use data, generate some insights and run these types of experiments to get the proof that we need through testing, in particular in this case, multi-channel. And again, it's this build, measure, learn type loop. So I just want to end on some of what we've learned about email fundraising. So please fire in your questions if you have them, because we're getting close to questions and answers time. So what we've learned about fundraising and fundraising in Canada specific to email is the more human looking, sounding and feeling an email is, the better it will perform. The more human looking, sounding and feeling an email is, the better it will perform. Now, is that a universal truth? No, but in general, on average, most of the time, this type of strategy works. And you've already seen some of these examples, but here's a few more kind of experiments or tests that kind of prove this. So why? The first thing is you can get more people to open your email. And that's the first stage or first part of the email journey is how do you get someone to even just open an email? So this test, organization on the left versus person on the right, sending from just an individual, saw a 28% increase in email opens. This organization has a person, comma, organization, and they tested that against just a person. Remove the organization name. and they saw an 18% increase in email opens. Now, part of the reason why this works is, one, there is a deliverability benefit, generally speaking, of sending an email from a person as opposed to a brand or organization. But when we look at how do humans behave, and again, we always need to be focused on empathy and understanding the person on the other side of the screen. These folks, Litmus and Fluent, did some research of how do we manage or triage our inboxes, and they found that who an email is from is actually the #1 way that you and I triage our inbox, more so than subject line and way more so than preview text. So this is actually what we're doing, and again, it's often at a subconscious level when we open our inbox and say, read, delete, star, flag, whatever system you have, it's who it's from. So when we send it from an individual, it stands out and someone's more likely to engage, therefore open and click. And very few Canadian charities are doing this. Again, when we did our study, over 3/4 of emails sent from Canadian charities were coming just from the brand or the organization, and few were coming from an individual or individual comma sender. So a glimpse at kind of our Canadian aggregate donor inbox, you can just see, not that a normal donor would get this many emails from Canadian charities, but there's a bunch of emails that they receive. And look, there's only a few that actually has a person's name in it. It's partly about standing out. So can you try sending emails from a person and not your organization? And hopefully you can prove that and validate it, but it's not just a person, maybe it's a different type of person. This organization has proven time and time again that sending from a person is better than a brand. But then they said, well, instead of sending from Albert Reyes, who's the CEO, what if we sent from Joanne Cole, who's the VP? In this case, sending from a different person, subject line's the same, email's the same, it's just a different sender. 85% increase in opens and 152% increase in donations by sending from a different person. So maybe you can send from a different person or a person or two, not just the same person every single time. So you can get opens and stand out in an inbox, but we've seen it lead to donations as well. That's human looking, sounding, feeling. This is an optimized email from our testing. This is what it looks like. It's pretty gross, right? I don't think so. If you're related to a designer or do design, you're just like throwing up in your mouth right now. But again, we've seen this work time and time again. Design versus no design. Removing design elements, we see a huge increase in donations. I showed you this one earlier. Removing header image, removing the kind of top pre-header text and image. We saw increase in clicks and donations. Our starting point should be, how does this design element help our donor understand our message? And we only add things that help instead of everyone sends emails this way. So let's start from that and then maybe think about how we remove. Why do we send big hero images on the top of emails? I've seen zero evidence from anyone that works, yet almost every charity does it. This is an example of just copying someone else, maybe assuming that they know what they're doing, but maybe they're just copying someone else who doesn't know what they're doing. Our standing point should be, how does this help? If it doesn't help, remove it, keep it out. Very few Canadian charities take this approach. When we looked at fundraising appeals, only 3% of the fundraising appeals that we received had that type of look. So the vast majority of Canadian charities and US charities have the emails that all kind of look the same. And why? We don't really know why. And what we found out more and more is it's not just fundraising emails, like newsletters, long newsletters, with articles and stories. Remove all those different things and we see an increase in click rate. So maybe we can remove design elements. And it's not just about design, it's how it sounds too. Can we use copy and text and words that's more personal and more about them? So this organization, I showed you an experiment from this organization earlier where they removed design elements and increased clicks and donations. This is a second test where they actually went further and changed a few different things, but along a common hypothesis of, will a more human looking, sounding, feeling email lead to response? And it did, 145% increase in donations. If I stack them side by side and kind of walk through this, you can see the first thing, the big logo, all the way at the bottom. If you see a big logo as the first thing when you open an email, you probably don't think, here's a very personal, valuable communication. You probably think someone's going to try and sell me something, right? So they wanted to have it to keep kind of brand and security or trust or whatever, so they just moved it to the bottom, so it's not the first thing that you saw. When it came time to like make a call to action, instead of using a donate button, they moved to a hyperlink, right? When you send your friends an email, you don't code it in a button, you probably hyperlink or even do a raw link. That's what they did. But the biggest thing here is the copy. So on the left, just reading it out loud, you can kind of hear, so hello, first name. When your world has been turned upside down, every connection counts, every bit of strength. every heart brought together. I wanted to do like the Bill Clinton thumbs thing there because it sounds, like a stump speech or something. Versus, I know you've been using CaringBridge recently to stay connected to your loved ones, and I hope it's been a source of strength for you. Which of those sounds more like a human? Which of those sounds like an email you'd receive from a friend or a family member? And then it continues on. On the left, it goes, Erica, who's 6-month-old son, Graham. And as a reader, you might be going, who are you? Why are you emailing me? You're launching into this story. I don't know who you are or why you're emailing me. Versus on the right now we're in a short campaign to raise money to keep our organization there for you and those like you who need a safe, protected place to connect during life's most challenging times. It's not about communicating these like epic stories necessarily, but being a human and sounding like a human and using the magic word you. This is an oversimplification of fundraising copy, but on the left, when your world versus you, your, you. If we can just flip the kind of us, we, ours to you, your, you should see a more positive increase in response from just fundraising copy. So when they remove design elements and change the copy to be a more personal looking sounding feeling, we saw a huge increase in donations. And we see that time and time again, Canada, US, small, large, across verticals. 100% of the time, no, but in general, on average, most of the time, yes, this approach works. And now there's more research and science behind this as well. The folks at Donor Voice, we're doing a research project with them. They've actually analyzed fundraising copy, both in letters and emails, based on some research around how to write copy that elicits a response. And they've developed a tool that can put fundraising copy on this quadrant, this 2x2 quadrant, where it goes from information on the left to involving language on the right and non-narrative on the bottom. Like romantic fiction is, pretty high involving, but super high narrative, or personal letters, very high involving, not that high on narrative. And then we actually gave them some experiments. So actually that last experiment I showed you, we sent them. And you can see that fundraising overall in the research is pretty non-narrative and informational, which sounds boring. A lot of information not structured in a narrative. It's kind of like, oh, boring. But all the research says the more that you get up into this quadrant, the better you will do. So that last experiment I showed you, the control sat over there, more narrative because they used that Erica, who's 6-month-old son, but not very involving. It was talking at me. Whereas the treatment was way more involving, a little bit less on the narrative, but that's the increase of the involving language made me as a reader and a donor more connected and engaged, and actually saw an increase in giving. So how can we include donors, not just talk at donors when it comes to email fundraising? That is the key principle here. And what we've seen overall, people give to people, not email marketing machines or websites. There's this concept called social presence, where you and I interact with emails and ATM machines and web pages almost as if they were human. So the more that we can have technology and emails and websites interact, sound like human, have conversational flows like human, we see it show up in fundraising results all the time. So some tips to kind of humanize your emails: send from a person and maybe different people within your organization. Can you remove design elements to make it feel and look more like a personal email? You can even try that with your more newsletter type content. And write emails like they sound from a person. One tip is write out your email and then read it out loud. Sometimes you can just hear yourself saying, ooh, this does not sound like a human, or this is very much about us as the organization, or just even think about how can this be more narrative format and more involving, and the involving piece is probably easier. Those are some tips to kind of humanize your email. So it's kind of like, all over the place. I have some other examples and data that I can show, but I want to make sure we have a lot of questions and discussion. So if you want to go deeper on this type of stuff, one, you can get that report that we did a few years ago in Canada. It's free. You can get it at bit.ly/Canadian Scorecard, or it's one of many different studies that you can find on our website. All of our research studies are free. You can find them at nextafter.com/institute. We recently did one on multi-channel communications, so phone, email, text, and mail we looked at. We did one for higher ed. We've done one on recurring. We're doing one right now with 9 different countries, including Canada. That should be live in the new year. So you can get the research. And then based off of those experiments, we have over 2,500 experiments now. That's what we use to generate things like ebooks and webinars and training guides and things like that, as well as courses. So we have online on-demand courses that you can purchase and get certified in different areas. So we have one on year-end fundraising that you might want to take. We developed a short free version, so 3 mini lessons that you can take for free. You can find that at nextafter.com/year-end. Or if you're interested in more of these courses and email optimization, donation pages, whatever it might be, you can go to courses.nextchapter.com. We have a special code Canada. It just offsets the exchange, but it's better than nothing. Or if you want to take more than one course, I'd suggest becoming a member or subscriber. You can access 9 different courses for $24.50 a month or so if you use the code Canada, or just email me, I'll get you a nice discount. So that's all I have. I can do more, but I want to leave time for questions, and if we don't get to them, that's my email. You can find me on LinkedIn or find me on Twitter. I'd love to hear your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brady. You've provided us with some amazing information that organizations can think about. I anticipate that you probably have sparked a number of questions. One that I have here that I'm going to get you started with is, for organizations that are just getting started or maybe less advanced, smaller nonprofits, where should we start?
Yeah, I think starting to capture email addresses wherever you possibly can is really, really critical. And then starting to send regular communications. So maybe, you know, sending an email a week is too much effort and work, but often that's going to be your source of online donations for sure, is kind of how many emails do you get. And so the more that you can, you know, get email opt-ins when you do events, if you raise money offline through direct mail or something, ask for people's email. On your website, you have places for people to sign up via email, and then even start looking at what is like a content offer. So something beyond a newsletter. Newsletters, to be honest, aren't super exciting. You know, unless I absolutely love your organization, I'm probably not going to sign up for a newsletter. So thinking more like, do you have a guide you can produce, you know, tips, some special research? If you've produced any blogs or, you know, podcasts or webinars, it's easy to turn that into something like an ebook and offer that to people to download in exchange for their email. But at some point, you're just going to run out of people to talk to. And so starting to accumulate and acquire emails and send emails on the online side is really, really critical. I mean, if you're starting off fundraising just full stop, you know, raising money through like board and personal relationships is much more critical than, you know, acquiring emails. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Great. In a small town, many organizations are asking donors for the same money that's available. So what tricks can we use in small communities to get the attention of our donors?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if your work isn't hyper local, then I mean, this is the beauty of online, is it's a bit of a leveling of the playing field. So now if you only work in one, you know, hyper local region, then, you know, me in Texas, I probably, you know, don't care that much about, you know, Winnipeg, for example. I care more about Calgary, where I grew up. So that could be a challenge, but, you know, don't limit yourself to thinking the only people that can care about this cause or this issue are just the people right in our own town. So that would be one thing. I think the opportunity in that kind of smaller town setting would be to actually think about partnerships with different organizations. Just if you know that you're talking to the same donors, is there a way that you could actually form some type of partnership or go to the same donor together, you know, and say like, hey, here's how these two organizations can work together. One's focused on, you know, homelessness and social service. You know, we're focused on food provision, and actually do like a joint proposal to the donor, something like that. I know that's like a lot more complicated and it's less of my world of expertise, but that is one of the advantages of being in a smaller community where you know each other and know the people. So don't like pretend that the donor doesn't know both of you or that you don't know each other, would be one thing. But I think, again, trying to expand that, one thing that we've seen, at least say on like the targeting side, sometimes we can get too wrapped up in, I only want to, you know, say show ads to or try to reach people in this geographic setup. And what we found is actually stepping back and letting different algorithms, whether it's Facebook or something like that, kind of help find people for you, is actually more effective than us saying people who live here or people who like these pages or people who have these interests, because that can be too assumptive and not necessarily the best either. So one idea is to take, who do your current donors or email subscribers look like, and you can actually like upload those lists into something like Facebook and say, can you find me more people that look like this? And we found that that's actually more effective than even more like advanced targeting techniques that we can do. So hopefully that helps a little bit. It's kind of a tough one.
Perfect. Should organizations explain to donors where the funds are going when they make a donation?
Where the funds are going, not necessarily. The impact of the gift, 100%. I I think that's something that we often get kind of confused, right? Is this like debate around unrestricted versus restricted? There's a legal side where like there's actually very, very few donations that are truly restricted unless it's like a multi-year commitment and like lawyers and gift people get involved. Every other gift to the organization's actually unrestricted and it's up to you to use it. Now, there's a non-legal contract that you have with the donor to live out their wishes, or if you say your donation today can help, you know, children in inner city Winnipeg, you can use that money for whatever you want. But the story that you have to tell or communicate to that donor is how they are part of changing the lives of kids in inner city Winnipeg. So that's more of the mindset that we need to have, is to help me understand what my donation will do. And then on the back end, help me understand what my donation did. And ideally, it would be the same type of thing. So, you know, don't get too hung up on restricted funds, but if we do kind of tell a very specific story on the front end, we need to be pretty good about telling the specific impact on the back end. And for what it's worth, there's a huge link between tangibility and generosity. So when we look at how do you get more donations, there's different ways that you can kind of communicate and show the value or the worthiness of your organization. And one of them is just clarity, or just being very simple and clear, tangible and specific. There's numerous research studies and a lot of our testing shows just the more simple, clear, and direct you are with what a donation does, the more likely someone is to give. And that's part of that gap that I was talking about, where we think we're being clear, but you step outside and from a donor's point of view, it's like, I'm not entirely clear what you do or what my donation will do. So that's really, really critical.
Okay, there's still people that are skeptical of online giving. Can you help them to understand how they can make digital fundraising easier and really build confidence in the donors?
Confidence in, so build confidence with the donors that their information's secure on that side, or organizations confident that they can raise money online, or both?
Donor data being secure.
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the critical things is actually showing that the information is secure on the donation page itself. It's something that in Canada, we found that like a third of organizations actually weren't re-emphasizing the security of the page. So some things you can do, like you're supposed to have your charitable registration number on the donation page somewhere. You should have a link to your privacy policy on the donation page somewhere. Those things should probably go something in the footer. Hopefully you're using a tool and a website that actually is secure. So up in your navigation, it will show a little lockbox and even say like HTTPS, which means it's secure. All that's a little bit around the fringes. Where we've seen the biggest lift and opportunity is right when people put in their credit card information, which is what people care most about for information security. That's where you should have like maybe a sentence that's like, all information provided is secure. We've seen experiments where you kind of like shade that part of the donation page a different color, add a little visual lockbox, a seal from some security, some kind of visual representation that people like, oh, this page is secure. So the vast majority of donation pages are secure, but I don't know that unless you tell me or show me. And so we encourage like a line that says like, please use the secure form below. And then when they go to the credit card information, there's some visual representation, lockbox or seal or something that shows that the donation information is secure right there. There's another part of this which is like trust. So this is where like, and imagine Canada Seal, you know, if you're a member of agricultural society, 4-H, like if you're a member of some association, even just having that seal on your donation page somewhere kind of in view can also build trust and kind of the credibility of your organization.
Fabulous. Do you have a donor or email database that you recommend?
Yes, but very, very, very cautiously. One thing about technology, and I used to sell technology, I've been in the digital space my whole career, it all kind of sucks. And meaning some of it's actually really good, but it never does all the things that we want it to, and it doesn't do all the things that some salesperson will tell you it does. So just want to make that clear, like there's always limitations. And so the things that we look for in good database or donation tool, one of them is like, how well does it play with other tools or integrate or have integrations? The kind of closed all-in locked system is very, very problematic because you're at the mercy of this one tool and provider, and they have no impetus to like improve the product. So we often look at, you know, how does it integrate? So get a good donation tool that integrates with a good donor database. don't look for a database that has a donation page, generally speaking. So that's like one of the things we look for. We also look for like flexibility. You know, can you add copy to it? Can you create more than one page? If you do any sort of sophisticated or more sophisticated online fundraising, the ability to like make tweaks to pages or copy pages or have 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of forms or pages is going to be paramount. So if you're starting out, maybe that's not that big of a deal, but very quickly you're going to run into those types of needs. So caveats aside, like don't hold me to this, but 2 donation tools that we'll often recommend. One is called Raise Donors. It's in the US. They do have some Canadian clients. A friend of mine who's an executive director out in BC, they use Raise Donors and they've been very happy. And the other one is Fundraise Up, is another tool that is also accessible in Canada. They can do CRA compliant tax receipts. Very different kind of approaches, but both good, flexible tools that integrate and play nicely with others. And then on the donor database side, we often suggest something called Virtuous. It's a little bit more expensive. It's a little bit more for medium to large size organizations, but it has some really good features like automation. So you can send out a tax receipt via the mail, a postcard 1 week after, and a thank you email 1 week after that. You know, so you can kind of set it up, and when a donor comes in, that stuff will all be automated. So you say like, well, man, how do we communicate to new donors, you know, rapidly? This is where systems and tools can be really, really important. So they have a lot of that baked into the product. So on the donor-based side, that's one. And then there's another one for small organizations that's based in Canada called Keela.co. Very different, not nearly as many bells and whistles, but also pretty good, plays nicely with others, and generally speaking, does a good job of managing data. So there's 4 tools that I very cautiously recommend.
What do you recommend if an organization doesn't have a large email distribution list? And what about email sharing and sharing a distribution list? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, so on the sharing one, that's a much bigger conversation, and a lot of it goes to how is that information being shared, or kind of who is the list broker and how is it being managed. We use list rentals quite a bit in the States. They're a lot less common in Canada, but we know that there's some lists are way better than others, and it's partly like how the list is managed. There are some list rentals that they'll just rent it out for cheap to anyone, and it really degrades the value of that list because those people are just, you know, getting hammered all the time. Generally speaking, I don't think it's a great thing. And even if you do a list rental, the strategy is normally how do we get them to opt into our list? So not just use a list rental to get a donation, because you'll get very few people, right? Someone going from not knowing you or barely knowing you to supporting you financially is a big gap to traverse. So the strategy is normally how do we use this email list rental to provide something of value, like a blog, an ebook, a petition, something other than a newsletter, generally speaking, so that they opt into your emails. Now they're your email, right? It's not a rented email. You rented it once, but now it's your email. Now you can build that relationship. That's normally how the strategy goes. You generally need more budget and time to make that make sense. So that's generally for large organizations. And then was the first part of the question, small organizations that don't have a big email list?
That's correct.
Again,
Yeah.
there's value in communicating email to major donors, institutional funders. Like again, communications is absolutely critical. So even if it's like 150 people that you have on your donor base or email list, starting to get in the practice of communicating frequently, hey, here's what's going on, here's what your donation is doing. That's like part of the contract that we enter into with donors, is that we will provide that level of kind of communication or customer service, and they can tell you like, hey, you know, I don't need to know all the time. They can opt out if they don't want to receive that much communication, but it's part of our job, and B, we know that that's what actually grows communication. So even if it's a small list, communicating somewhat regularly is key. And again, starting to figure out how can we grow this list is going to be paramount for online fundraising. Now, most of the time, if it's like, how do we grow quicker, you're better off doing, you know, in-person events when we can, you know, personal phone calls. And so email in that sense is way more like personal, you know, out of Gmail or Outlook as opposed to mass email. But when it comes to growing online revenue, again, it's getting into that habit of communicating regularly and figuring out how can we get more emails organically through things we're doing, and then more proactively through content offers and generating traffic to our sites.
Okay, when you think about the research your team has done, what stands out as the biggest opportunity for charities?
That is a great, great question. Um, I think the thing that I was talking about earlier is like being clear or focusing on clarity is probably the biggest opportunity. So whether it's like, why should I sign up for this email? Why should I click this email? Why should I give to this organization? The research question that we ask, and what we call it the value proposition question, is why should I give to your organization as opposed to another organization, or not at all? Now, donors aren't really asking themselves that question, or they'll not tell you that they are, but fundamentally, we think that's the question that you have to answer in the mind of the donor in your emails and on your website. Or if it's like, why should I give you my email as opposed to give it to another organization or business, or not at all? And so just thinking about this question puts us in this position of like, we need to communicate why someone should do it. So when we go out and do research and we sign up for emails and look at donations, so much of the time, email goes, newsletter sign up, name an email. Why would I do that? Why on earth would I give you my valuable email when I have no sense of what your newsletter is, how often it goes out, what it can look like, what it can offer to me? Or we go to a donation page and there's no copy on the page at all. It's just like donate today and a form. The only people that will give are the people who already know and love you. And this is often the big barrier for smaller organizations that grow up to a point and then they plateau, is that the early days, the kind of like more hardcore connected people, you could almost say or do anything and they'll give because they have some really strong personal connection to you. But then getting beyond those people, are like that second circle of influence, where they don't know you, they maybe don't have a personal connection. This is where the answer to that value proposition question is so key. Why should I like you? Why are you to be trusted? What will you do with my donation? These questions are absolutely critical. And a lot of organizations spend very little time and energy to answer that question. So we need to err on the side of answering that question. If I already know and love you, I can do a little quick scroll. I can maybe just gloss over some bullet points and make a donation. But if I don't already know and love you, I have to get some kind of value or understanding of what my donation will do. So I think that's honestly the biggest opportunity, is how do we communicate why someone should do something, particularly give. And then for small organizations, it's generating traffic. When we do our data research, or we'll start working with a new client, or we'll do a benchmarking report, a lot of organizations have really good conversion rates, or the number of people that give is solid, and the generosity is often higher for small organizations, right? You've got these loyal, committed people. So the biggest element that they're missing is just volume. You don't get enough traffic to your website, you don't get enough emails, you don't send enough emails. And so if you're looking to grow online, that's normally the place where organizations suffer, is they don't generate enough traffic to the website on a consistent basis to make online really work.
Okay, what do you think stops organizations from using data or doing testing to help do better online fundraising?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of things. I think time and capacity is one. Like my very first job out of grad school, I was the director of development for a small nonprofit, and I was the first and only full-time employee. And you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off. You've got like events, you got to send emails, you're managing a database. So to think about like, I need to slow down and come up with a test idea and run this test, it's very difficult, and it seems slower. The irony is, if we don't actually slow down and do that type of level of looking at data or running some experiment, we don't actually know which of our energy is working, right? So then we just keep doing all the things on the hamster wheel. And this is how we end up kind of burning out, or not really having the success, even though we're working super hard. So I think it's, again, counterintuitive to a degree, but we need to have this understanding of, how do I know what's working so that I can make the most of my time, energy, and limited resources. So I think that's one thing, is capacity. I think there's one thing around like tools. That's a big thing. I mean, even with large clients, and we typically work with really, really large organizations on the client side, on our consulting business, which is the main thing. I'm on the research side of saying like, what works with all these big organizations and how can we take it and teach other organizations to do it. But even large organizations, tons of them don't have Google Analytics set up, right? Which lets you know where donations are actually come from. So some of those charts I showed earlier, in terms of paid search, organic search, a lot of charities don't have that set up. They don't have a donation page tool that they could even run a test on. And then there's like knowledge, right? They maybe don't know that there's this thing called Google Optimize, which is a free tool. a little snippet of code, and you can change any page on your website and run a test. It's a free thing, Canada, US, right? So there's a little element of knowledge. So I do think there's starts with like capacity or feeling like I don't have enough time. But again, that's a double-edged sword. Then there's this element of like the tools that we use of just not being set up properly. And that's where I think a lot of service providers have like totally failed nonprofits and charities in terms of inadequate tools. And then there is a knowledge problem of just like, I don't know what is out there or how to actually test.
I feel like you have shared a number of tools related to digital fundraising, but are there any others that you'd reference or encourage us to consider to make digital fundraising easier?
Sure. Yeah. On the email side, we're generally fans of MailChimp as opposed to like a constant contact type of thing. One, it integrates really well with a bunch of other tools. Two, it has some automation. So if you wanted to do like a new donor series or a new email subscriber series, it has that functionality. And the pricing structure, I think, is good too. Like as your email list grows, then you pay more money as opposed to just like a flat fee. So I think that works generally pretty well. So that's what we recommend for like smaller to medium-sized organizations. Larger organizations, we're big fans and users of HubSpot. So HubSpot's like a marketing intelligence type platform. So if you like go on our website, for example, and say you visit like our training page and you're on there for like 30 seconds, and we have your email or we can track you, you may get an email from me that says like, hey, I saw you were looking at training. It's a lot more advanced, like one-to-one communication, but at scale. And those types of tools that use marketing intelligence I think are really, really powerful. And to me is like where fundraising is going. So instead of like the e-blast, which is a terrible name for communications, like let's blast you, it's going to be a series of more segmented personal emails that we can manage because of these types of tools. So those are two kind of on the email side. Another tool worth looking at is called Zapier. So Zapier.com. And so if you're looking at tools, one of the things is to look at Zapier and say, does this work with Zapier? So what Zapier does is it's a bridge tool. So basically, how do you take, MailChimp that sends emails and how does it connect to your, donor database? Say you're using Keela, and maybe MailChimp and Keela don't integrate, although I think they do. If they both integrate with Zapier, then you can basically do like a if then this type rule, and it'll connect the data for you. So if it doesn't have what's called a native integration, maybe they can integrate with Zapier and it can get you the data back and forth in a pretty seamless automated way. So that's a really, really crucial tool as well that make tools that don't naturally talk to each other.
Okay, I have another question related to social media. Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, are they all the same, or is one better than the other related to fundraising?
Yes, Facebook by a mile, and it's not even close. Now, I should also say that for organic social media, so just like the posts that you do, we have zero data and evidence to show that it's actually that important. There is some importance of just like communications and some of that priming, and touch point. The only value we've been able to really extract for fundraising from social media is through paid ads on Facebook. That's the only thing. Now, I will say like we're not experts in social media, and that's partly because we have zero data that says we should be experts in social media. So paid ads on Facebook is pretty much the only thing that we do for paid. We do some paid search and we'll use the Google ad grant, but almost all like paid focus is on Facebook because it's typically better for boomers and up, which is the ideal donor segment. And the targeting that they have is creepy, but also effective in terms of managing your ad spend. Organic social, like oftentimes we'll say you should just maybe post a note that says, to follow our work, please sign up for email here, and just don't even spend time actually engaging on it. The worst thing you can do is like try to engage and then just not be engaging. That leaves a worse taste in people's mouth than just saying, we're not on Twitter, we're not on Snapchat, follow us on Instagram. That's the one channel that we manage. And again, it's not that there's not value in there. This is one of the hardest things for us as marketers and fundraisers. It's return on investment or prioritization. It's not that there's not value in Facebook and managing organic posts. It's that the value of getting and sending emails is a million times higher. So that's where we need to be focusing our time and energy. So again, it's not that there's no value. It's very difficult to make the argument that anything but really large organizations should spend a lot of time on organic social media, if I'm honest.
Okay, if smaller organizations are considering hiring someone to do their fundraising for them, do you have any tips or best practices that you would encourage organizations to consider before contracting or hiring a staff person to do it?
Yeah, I think if you're hiring like an individual to do fundraising, I think the thing that you can't outsource is like personal relationships. So being very clear of, like your revenue goals, or maybe like more major donors and maybe institutional or grants. That's a very different type of fundraising, and often a different type of person than more of like the direct response, more marketing type fundraiser. And so I think making it very clear of which side, I mean, ideally those are like two separate roles, but I understand if you're small, you can choose one. Making it very clear to yourselves internally which side you're going to err on. Would we rather get 1,000 small donors or 10 large donors? And you write the job description, you set the goals, because those are very different metrics that you would measure them on, different timelines for when that becomes profitable to your organization. Don't lump all of those into one role, and then also expect them to have success in everything. Everyone will gravitate one way or the other. I'm way more of a marketer, communicator type fundraiser than a fundraising face-to-face person, which isn't to say I can't do it. I have done it or could do it. But if I sit down at the beginning of the day, everyone gravitates one way or the other. And so writing a job description that's very clear, it's more this than this, I think is hugely important. 2, don't expect, if it's more of this fundraising kind of face-to-face major gifts person, don't expect them to raise their salary for 2 years. This idea that you can 2x, 5x, 6x your salary in a year or 2 years, it's crazy. It's part of the reason why people leave their jobs, get fired. There's high turnover. The expectation of what people can do and what time frame, I think we're way off base with expectations. And then if it's more of the like direct marketing fundraiser, generating revenues is one part, but they're helping build like a following and a brand. And so even saying like raise X of your salary, it's not even in that conversation. That's not really what you're hiring that person to be. So those are for like smaller organizations hiring a person or maybe a person or two. It's way easier to outsource like digital media, right? There's firms, there's one out west called Frontier, there's one called Yibu Digital that's more out east, that you have to pay some money, but they have a team of like digital experts who will be able to set up Facebook ads and run tests and automate emails. That stuff's more easy to purchase. You can't purchase someone with relationships. So that's, if I was setting up an organization, I'd focus more on the, administration and personal relationships, and maybe think about contracting out to writers or agencies more of the ongoing digital to a point. At some point, you're going to want to bring that in-house, but it's easier to find some help in the short term.
Excellent. And that's getting us wrapped up here, but I'm just going to ask you any last minute closing tips or tricks that you want to share with the audience before we close?
I think the only thing is it can be really tempting to be overwhelmed, right? Like there's so many things that you could or should do. There's so much data, there's so many tools. The thing that I suggest and that we always say is just start doing one thing and just get better as you go. You don't have to have the best donation page, the best CRM, the best email before you kind of start, because A, that'll never exist, and B, it'll take you too long. So thinking through like, you know what, we don't communicate frequently enough to our donors via email. Let's send more non-ask emails, and then as you start doing that, then you can figure out sending from people or, the ratio of asks or something. It's about actually like starting kind of small and growing. And that's the big advantage of digital. We're like, you can get some things wrong, learn from it and move on, because there's not a lot of expense. The biggest asset we have is time. So don't waste time, use time to kind of get started and learn on even just one thing or two things, instead of putting it off and waiting 6, 12 months, because that's the thing that we know doesn't lead to success. So don't get too overwhelmed. Try to focus on one or two things. Start now and get better.
That is fabulous. Brady, I just really enjoyed your session. It was exceptional. I believe that you have inspired a number of organizations to consider some alternatives and new approaches within their fundraising strategies. So thank you so much for being with us today. We are going to transition over to our fund development leader panel now. We were going to take a short break, but we are just going to continue with the momentum that we have generated. And we will continue on. And I'm going to transition over to my colleague, Leanne Sprung.
Hi, thank you very much, Leanne Tibbetts. I am really thrilled to be here, and I too am motivated by Brady's presentation for my own volunteer commitments that I have, as well as what I think will have been shared, or what I think people will have gained who are on the webinar and who will watch the recording and take a look at the slides following when they're emailed out. I have the privilege today of introducing and moderating the Fund Development Leader Panel. And just a bit of background, the idea to hold a fund development seminar arose last fall, last summer, in response to some of the other seminars that we've been having in this series. And it's become, so we started the work on it, and we identified our people that we would like to have join us, and it became pretty clear in early this year that this was going to have to be a virtual presentation, that we wouldn't be able to meet in person. It's also become increasingly important, and that reference was made earlier to this morning, that given the current economic climate, the pandemic and the resulting restrictions, we have to do things differently. So traditional fundraising systems have been disrupted, which requires leadership in organizations to evaluate their current practices and reposition themselves. So each person on today's panel has their own perspective and experience related to fundraising, and I'm very excited to hear from our panelists. Our first panelist is Andrew Cussey. He's an certified fundraising executive and development manager at the Dream Factory. Dream Factory is a Manitoba-based children's charity that brings dreams to life for kids in our province who are battling life-threatening illnesses. Andrew's area of expertise involves establishing creative donor partnerships and building long-term relationships with donors based on their philanthropic goals and interests. So I would like to welcome Andrew Cussey to share his screen and provide his presentation, and I will pop off. Thank you, Andrew, and welcome.
Thank you for having me. Everyone should be able to see my presentation now. So I'm really happy to be here, really excited to be speaking with everyone today. Like Leanne mentioned, my name's Andrew. I am the fundraising manager at the Dream Factory. We make dreams come true for kids across the province that are battling life-threatening illnesses. So I am fundraising out there just like all of you are. It's a tough time, so I'm with you. I know that there's a whole bunch of challenges around fundraising in a pandemic. So what I'd like to talk about a little bit today is creative partnerships, what that looks like for us at the Dream Factory, and what that might look like at your organization. There was a question during the last presentation about, in a small community, it's difficult to get attention or to stand out because there's only so many donors and so many causes. I think one of the things, and Brady did allude to it, one of the things that really can make a difference is developing a creative partnership. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means to us at the Dream Factory and how that might apply to your organization. One thing of note, kind of before I get into it, is that everything I'm going to be talking about, I think, is really scalable based on where your organization is at today. So if you're just getting started on fundraising, you don't have a lot of these kind of infrastructure pieces set up yet, this is still something that you can implement into your program. And if you're part of a really big organization where fundraising is kind of more rigid, creative fundraising might be something to start thinking a little bit differently about. So what makes a partnership creative? We all know how corporate partnerships work. That's something we're familiar with. You partner with a company, there's some element of fundraising. Maybe you are making a $2 donation when you're checking out at the grocery store, and that's kind of the extent of what a partnership looks like. What makes a partnership creative is when it becomes really clear what the why of the partnership is, what the impact will be, who will be affected, and how you are directly supporting the organization and its mission. So a creative partnership excels in making it very clear who is being helped and how. And it's clear throughout the partnership. So it's how to put the stories and your mission at the forefront of everything that you're doing. So like I said, a creative partnership must answer the why. My criteria for a creative partnership follows three things. And this is kind of without exception when I'm working with a new donor about putting together a partnership for our organization and with our dream kids. Here are the things that I start the conversation with. I'll tell a donor that my goal in building a partnership when we're doing that brainstorming process, it obviously has to raise funds. You know, there has to be some fundraising component to the partnership. It also has to raise awareness. The goal is that more people know about the organization and not just know our name and logo, but have an understanding of what we do. And three, will it tell the story of your mission? So in the context of the Dream Factory, what that looks like is how do we get our kids and our families involved? These are kids that have just gone through some really difficult battles, some really tough things. How do we create a little bit of fun for them in the partnership that will also tell people the story of what we do? So I call that a mission first approach to a partnership. And that comes from really thinking about who your donors are. I think in a lot of organizations, it's easy to start from a list of donors and say, who can give? Who in our community is the wealthiest? Who has the most to give? Who is the most philanthropic? But I think you can also benefit from looking at your mission and starting there. So for example, we had a dream kid a few years ago. Her dream was to go to Italy. So rather than looking at our donor list and figuring out, you know, this person hasn't given in a while, this person is philanthropic to other places, we talked about all of the donors, all of the people we know in our community who might be interested in supporting a dream to Italy. So we reached out to our Italian community, we reached out to Italian business owners and brought together a kind of a community of support that way. So that's what I mean when I say mission first. In terms of local examples, I gave a few from the Dream Factory. Think about if there's any examples of creative partnerships that exist in your communities. I'd love to see them in the chat or in the questions, but think about what those might look like. Another example I tend to give is from the Main Street Project, a wonderful charity here in Winnipeg. A few years ago during the Jets playoff run, they hosted a whiteout party for everyone staying at Main Street Project. So they brought in a partner, established a partnership with a local restaurant, brought in meals for everyone, had a whiteout party in the space. So one, they connected with a new partner and received an in-kind donation. Check one for the criteria. It raised awareness of what Main Street Project is, not only as a space for our city's homeless, but also as a community gathering space. And three, it told a mission story. The Main Street Project, one, is interested in doing creative, unique things that kind of think outside the box. And they view their space as more than just a shelter. It's a space where people can gather, where people have community, where positive moments can take place. So I thought that was kind of a really effective, smaller example of a creative partnership. Now I'm going to talk about a few examples from the Dream Factory. So the first example is of a cause-related marketing campaign. So cause-related marketing, for folks who don't know, is kind of what I mentioned earlier. A company sells a product, donates a portion of that product to the organization. What we did is we held a pie party. So it was essentially just a bake sale. Here are a few photos from our event in 2019. A few things to know about the pie party. The leading partner in this event was actually a pharmacy. I know pharmacy has nothing to do with pie or baking or etc. But the pharmacy had the most important part, which is they wanted to help. they wanted to get involved. And when I had my initial meeting with the pharmacy, I told them a little bit about Zachary, a child we had just met. Zachary's mom made a point of letting us know that his favorite thing in the world, his favorite food, was anything in pie format. So I kind of anecdotally told that story. The donor really liked it, and they became invested in doing something specifically for Zachary. So they reached out, they canvassed the community, and they reached out to a whole bunch of restaurants to get a whole bunch of pies together. We had a big bake sale, and over $9,000 was raised, which was far beyond what any of us expected. In terms of our initial criteria, we raised funds, we raised awareness in terms of earned media and folks coming by, and every single person who came knew that by buying a piece of pie, I'll go back, buying a slice of pie, supporting the initiative, they were helping to make Zachary's dream come true. I know with an organization like the Dream Factory, it's easy to say this is not the most difficult fundraising ask in the world. These are really incredible kids fighting tough battles. People really want to help. But the principles behind some of these creative partnerships will kind of carry forward to your organization. So think about what some of these things could look like in the context of your charities. Who benefits? Who are the people that you're telling stories about? And how can those transform into story and mission-based partnerships? Another example is public awareness campaigns. So really spreading the word about your organization. In June of 2019, we had kids take over the Winnipeg Free Press. So this was a marketing public awareness campaign that we hosted. We had kids take over the paper for the day. So this is what the front page of the paper looked like on that day. We had articles throughout the paper written by our dream kids. You can see Zach here interviewed his hockey hero, Josh Morrissey. Mayor Bowman was involved. And this little dude on the left giving a big thumbs down because traditional news is boring. That's Preston, and he's actually one of our dream kids. So it was cool to get him involved in the campaign as well. So this was something a little bit different, a little bit out there. Our target for the campaign was two things. We wanted to increase our amount of monthly donors and really get the word out. And we actually wanted to increase the amount of referrals. We wanted people to know that they have the ability to refer a sick child in our province to the Dream Factory, and that we don't want any kids in our province going through the experience of having a sick child without accessing our resources. So we creatively told the story. There's Zach checking out his interview, and people really took away what the Dream Factory is about. We're the type of organization that is going to come and take over the paper. Everything we do is going to be a lot of fun. The last one I'll breeze through really quickly is a third-party event. This is called Deadlifts for Dreams. By looking at me, you might be able to tell I don't know a ton about deadlifting, but the important message here is to work with folks who are interested in supporting you in whatever way is best for them. We had a donor named Dave Beakley. He knew he wanted to help, but he didn't know how. And I asked him, well, what are you good at? He said, well, I run a gym. I'm good at lifting heavy things. And Deadlifts for Dreams was born. What really worked for Deadlifts was creating a very specific story about what strength means in our community and how some of our strongest physically deadlifters in the province were helping some of the kids in our province who are just as strong fighting some really tough battles. So over the last couple of years, we've raised over $55,000 through these events. All three of these initiatives had some element in 2020 that have pivoted to virtual to make sure they're able to keep going. And we can talk about that during the questions a bit. So where to start really quickly? Make sure you have a mission-first approach. Storytelling is key. Make sure you have a really good story about your mission. have a integrated content strategy, and I'm going to share a few examples of how you can do that. So make sure social media, blog, website, you're telling the same story everywhere. And use skilled volunteers. If in your organization, social media is not your forte, it's not your strong suit, find a dedicated volunteer who thrives in this area and let them be involved and have some ownership. Everyone will get these slides after, so I'm going to go through really quickly. These are some resources that if you haven't considered might help you out. Canada Helps for online giving, doing some of those peer-to-peer fundraising events like the Deadlifts for Dreams. Easy to use, widely adopted. Donors understand how to use this platform because many organizations use it. Canva for graphic design, really simple graphic design you can do from the side of your desk. Anyone can learn it, and they have a pro version that is free to charities. So access this resource. Free to charities, you won't need a dedicated graphic designer. This is something that someone on your team can pick up and learn. Here's an example of a donor report that I put together in Canva. It just shows you kind of what the interface looks like. Trello for content strategy, and then TechSoup is a website where you can access a whole bunch of online software for nonprofit discounts. So your Office, Adobe Suite, CRMs. If you need technology, always check TechSoup first. This is Trello. It's an example of how we plan out our content. You can see there's blog content, social media content, what we've posted, stewardship requirements for one of our donors who is Sobeys. And I will give volunteers access to this during periods where I need help. It's a collaborative space where you can kind of keep track of what you want to post in terms of your content and how that works. So this is my contact information. I would love to connect with anyone who wants to chat more, either by email or LinkedIn, but I think I'm a few minutes over my time. So I'm going to pass it back to Leanne, and I look forward to chatting with you guys more during the questions. Thanks so much.
Oh, wow, that was awesome. Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And yes, as he mentioned, we will be looking at the questions in the question box again. So please put your questions there. And that was another inspiring and innovative way to move on with our panel today. So our next panelists are Kelly McLaughlin and Jenny Sakovac. Kelly is an independent fundraising consultant based in the Washington, D.C. area. So thank goodness for virtual. We can have representatives and people from all over. We also became aware of Kelly's expertise in some of the Next After programming that Leanne and I have been participating in since we've started researching fund development for organizations. So that's how we got to know about Kelly. She's learned from leaders within large nonprofits and applied their systems and practices to work for small nonprofits, those with tiny budgets, too few staff, and other resource restrictions. She pairs this expertise with principles of behavior change management learned from her years as a fitness trainer. This helps ensure the changes stick and contribute to long-term growth within nonprofits. Jenny Sakovac is an instructor for the University of Winnipeg's Professional Applied Continued Education Program, teaching fundraising and fund development. Jenny was responsible for event planning, data management, social media, donor stewardship, and volunteer management prior to her role with PACE in her roles at the Arthritis Society and Canadian Cancer Society. She's a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Manitoba branch. And so we look forward to hearing from both Jenny and Kelly. And they're going to turn on their cameras now, and I'll field some questions, or I'll throw some questions to them for them to respond. And then at the end, Andrew will come on, and there'll be opportunity for all three of them to participate. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Jenny. Welcome.
Hi.
So Jenny, I'll direct the first question to you. Fund development planning can be an overwhelming task, and that Brady used that word, earlier, overwhelming. Or a challenge for smaller organizations. Can you briefly just explain the process of fund development planning?
Absolutely, thanks, Leanne. Fund development, the process of planning, it takes the previous year's information. So what you're doing is you're doing an analysis. You're talking about and reviewing what went well, what went wrong, and what could be improved. And that covers absolutely everything in terms of your annual giving plans. So your major gifts, your monthly giving, special events, your bequests and endowments. Determining what you can increase in terms of your budget line and what you can remove. For example, if you had a fundraising event last year that raised X number of dollars, do you want to continue doing it again this year, or has it lost money? So do you scrap that fundraising event and decide to do something else? So it's basically looking at reviewing your plan and determining what you can include going forward. It also depends on your budget. It depends on how much money you need to raise. So if you have a particular project that you want to raise, whether it's a new database or something that in the community, can you include that in your budget line? And is it important? So what can you do to raise the money the most efficiently and effectively?
Okay, so you're talking about maybe return on investment?
Yes, and so return on investment and the cost to raise a dollar are also part of this. Now, the cost to raise a dollar it used to be the accepted measure of a good charity. The general perception was that the lower the cost per dollar raised, the better the organization. However, it's important to know that when you're raising, the cost to raise a dollar is the efficiency, the fundraising efficiency, and the return on investment is the fundraising effectiveness. So I want to talk about the idea of your net profit. All right, so what your fundraising cost equals expenses divided by gross revenue. So for instance, if you spent $2,500 and generated gross revenue of $10,000, your fundraising cost would be approximately 25 cents per dollar raised. Now, these are hard costs. Your expenses are hard costs. The revenue that you raise is hard revenue. These are costs that you cannot quibble about. But if you want to get the true cost of the cost to raise a dollar or your return on investment, you have to think about your net. And what the net is, you are including your staff cost. All right, so in our previous example where we're talking about it cost $2,500 and you raised $10,000 and the cost to raise a dollar was 25 cents per dollar. However, if your staff time was $5,000, so you're taking the number of hours per the staff's salary, your fundraising cost would now be 75 cents per dollar. Now, taking that into account, is it worthwhile to do this fundraising event again because you had so much staff time involved? Or do you take a look and review it and decide, okay, we may have a staff person overseeing it, maybe there's a committee involved, maybe there's volunteers involved. And volunteers are the backbone of any nonprofit organization. A nonprofit organization, especially the smaller ones, because when I was working at the Arthritis Society, there were only 6 of us, including the executive director. We couldn't do nearly half of what we were doing without our team of volunteers. So it's important to consider when you are looking at your fundraising plan and the process, do you have that volunteer component? Is your board of directors involved? Is your staff involved? Not just development staff, not just fundraising coordinators, but everybody. Is everybody pitching in to make sure that your fund development plan is successful or will be successful going forward?
Perfect. Well, and that brings up so many good points that you have to look at all of the costs, everybody's time, and that has a value to it. So thanks for that, Jenny.
You're welcome.
Kelly, what can organizations do to make their fundraising campaigns or strategies more sustainable?
For sure. So, I mean, as Jenny said, you want to look at the cost of raising a dollar and definitely the staff time, right? I think that's one of the things we most under calculate when we're talking about the cost of raising a dollar. And so one of the things that I work with a lot of organizations on is making a transition from transactional fundraising to relationship-based fundraising. And what I mean by that is transactional is when somebody gets something for donating to you. So we're talking about events, for example. Events is my hobby horse. I beat up on events all the time. But yeah, so with events, you're having to recreate that event every single year. You can save some time over the course of, if it's an annual event that you do over and over, you know, rinse and repeat, and so it takes a little less planning time. But at the same time, you're doing a lot of things that are not fundraising directly, right? So you're doing things like picking a menu if it's a seated dinner, or it's choosing a venue if you're having to move venues, right? So those are things that aren't directly fundraising, but you're adding to your cost to raise a dollar. In addition, you are saying, hey, come to our gala and you'll get a dinner and some drinks and that kind of thing. So somebody's getting something for that ticket purchase. And yes, you can activate people. Events that are done well can activate people to donate based on the strength of the mission and that kind of thing. But there's still a transaction taking place. And so if you're not thoughtfully cultivating donors after that transactional based fundraising event or campaign or whatever, you're gonna have people dropping off. Whereas if you're building relationships with your donors, and you're doing that consistently over time, and after somebody donates, you're thanking them and stewarding them in a robust way where they're receiving updates, quarterly reports, phone calls, those kinds of things, you're building a relationship so that you don't necessarily, especially we're seeing this problem right now. I'm seeing this with so many of my clients, is we rely on this event and now we can't do it because of COVID and nobody is donating. And it's because we haven't built up the relationship with those donors. So right now we're seeing that as a crisis, but it's something that was predictable based on how fundraising works. So that's the big pivot that I like to make with a lot of my clients, is going from something transactional, donate to us and you get this thing, or you get to come to an event, and pivoting to a relationship based where it's about the strength of your mission and the affinity that donors have to your mission, and that's the motivator. I especially like to say with relationship based fundraising, you want a donor to say, I am a donor of this organization. That's part of their identity. The organizations that I really love, when I see them, I say, oh, that's my organization, right? That's what we're trying to build in our donors, is that, like, when they see your logo, when they see your emails, they're like, oh, that's my org, right? So that's what relationship-based fundraising looks like and feels like, and that's the pivot that so many nonprofits need to make, because we're so stuck in how do we just make a buck really quickly versus how do we turn this more sustainable. And the way that's more sustainable is, instead of having to run the same event over and over and over and get the same number of people coming and all of that kind of thing, you are building an affinity with people that are going to give more over time. And they're gonna give more, they're gonna recruit their friends. That's a type of fundraising that can grow your mission rather than just put you on the hamster wheel of making the same amount of money year after year. For sure.
Okay, so that sounds, and that's very consistent with what we've heard as well, is that relationship. And wouldn't that be awesome if we could all have those kinds of donors that say, that's my org? That's going to be my new mantra, Kelly. That's good.
Love it. It's a good one.
It is. Okay, so Jenny, back to you. And as we develop these questions, we will come back to some of more of the transactional and donor-centered work. But Kelly, tell us about the value of diverse tactics or multi-channel fundraising. And so that was a new term to me when we started researching this, was the multi-channel. And I thought, what is this? But then as I learned more, it's kind of what people are doing. Sorry, Jenny, did you want to say something else?
Oh, no, sorry. I thought, oh, no, that's okay. I thought I was talking about multi-channel fundraising.
Yeah, that's a question we were gonna pivot to Jenny.
Okay, Jenny, sorry.
Yes, that's okay.
I've got my questions mixed up. So Kelly, you go ahead. Okay.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. So multi-channel fundraising. I know that Brady touched a little bit about it, and I think Andrew also mentioned about it as well. It's the way that your donors have a way of fundraising. So you're giving them options. And I know that there was email marketing. There's also direct response marketing. There's also online marketing, but there's also mobile. So people have I have my cell phone with me. People have their cell phone. And if you can make it easy for people to fundraise using their cell phone, sending a text, text 12345, click here, this is how much I want to donate, boom, it's done. You've got your credit card already linked up to your phone. So it's easy peasy, and it makes it easier for the donor to quickly make that donation without having to think about it. Oh, do I have to send a check? Where's the website I have to go to? Sometimes, depending on the website, the donate button isn't as obvious as it should be. So what you're doing is you're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to donate. And I also want to talk about the different ways of approaching a donation. So there's Giving Tuesday. Now, Giving Tuesday was originally started in the United States, and it's the Tuesday after. So there's the American Thanksgiving on the Thursday. There's Black Friday shopping on Friday, although I don't think that's going to happen this year. Monday was known as Cyber Monday. So if you couldn't go to the store in person, you do your shopping online. And then Giving Tuesday is the day after. So everybody has, they've eaten lots of turkey and pumpkin pie. They've spent all their money, but maybe they haven't spent all their money. Maybe there's still some money left over. And so Giving Tuesday is such a successful event for nonprofits to get involved with. I just want to give you some stats. So in the United States in 2019, $511 million was raised on Giving Tuesday in 2019. That's a 28% increase over 2018. And over 150 countries are involved in their own Giving Tuesday campaigns.
So
and
that's
when you think
adding on or taking advantage of those broader initiatives, which can really benefit.
Yeah, and the thing about Giving Tuesday, and this is where, whether you're a small nonprofit or a larger nonprofit, it is another way for you to stand out, because there's competition for that donor dollar. And I know in Manitoba, Manitobans are very generous and they donate to a lot of causes, but there's only so much money to go around. So how can you make your campaign stand out? I know Kelly was talking about affinity. So there's affinity, but there's also capacity, right? So there's the capacity to give, and is there affinity with your organization? So if you have, so your mother had cancer, so you might want to donate to a cancer organization, diabetes, whether it's, your Dream Factory, whatever the affinity with that particular cause will help you to donate more. And depending on how easy and how successful you are in marketing your Giving Tuesday campaign will determine how successful that campaign is. And I know that in Winnipeg, just very quickly, I just want to talk about also the other ways of multi-channel fundraising. So October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. November is Movember. I know that the United Way has their United Way campaigns in the fall. So these are a number of different opportunities that you can reach out and to the prospective donors as well as your current donor base. And again, it gets back to that affinity.
So many opportunities, and making sure that you're part of those opportunities and giving people many ways. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jenny.
You're welcome.
So Kelly, what are some best practices in moving an organization from transactional to donor-centered fundraising?
For sure. So I like to think about the donor experience. This is something that's kind of pioneered in the marketing field. And as Brady said, there's a lot of marketing and fundraising that's very adjacent. So I like to think about a donor pipeline, or some people call it a funnel. I like to think of it as a pipeline, but where we're trying to move our relationship with our donor from they've never heard of us before to that affinity, that this is my organization, this is who I give to. And that process takes a number of steps. So the first step is to identify those people. Where are they most likely to be? That can be in the broad universe, or it can be who's in your database that you want to get more active. Who are those one-time donors that gave once and never gave again, right? So that it can be, their starting point can be everybody everywhere, or it can be within your own database. But you want to start by thinking about identifying who are the people I want to target with this campaign. And so sometimes I think about that as I want to try and find people on I want to get people from our Facebook page into our email to get them to give. So that's a specific campaign, right? So that's my target, who I've identified. Then there's the cultivation step, is kind of the next step. After you've figured out who you want to try and target, you want to think about how you're going to cultivate that segment. So I like to say this is a big storytelling point. People love stories. We are a storytelling species. You know, so telling the story of your organization. Why was it founded? I love a structure of, there was a problem, we came up with a solution, and here's the results, right? So that's a great narrative. And so you want to create this narrative, whether it's about the founding of your organization or a specific client who has benefited. You want to tell some stories to get people engaged, right? You're building that affinity. And then there's the solicitation stage. Once you've done some cultivating, it's time to ask. I like to say, if you're going to make a donor relationship analogous to marriage, like identify as the speed dating event that you go to, cultivating is the dating, and then the solicitation is the proposal, right? Will you marry me, right? So you're asking for that. But I like to also liken it to marriage, because marriage is not the end of your relationship, right? Far from it. It's the beginning of a new type of relationship. So you ask, they hopefully say yes and donate, and then you've got to work more on the relationship, because now this person is bought into your organization, right? And so the biggest problem I see in the nonprofit world is we treat our donors like ATMs. We say, I need some money, thank you. And then we get the money and we leave. And maybe we send a nice thank you email, and so we pat ourselves on the back for doing good stewardship, right? But if you liken this to the marriage analogy, once they donate to you, you've got a new relationship. They're bought in, they're committed. So you've got to continue to build this relationship. So that's the stewardship. So that's things like quarterly reports. That's things like calls from board members. That's things like, I've seen organizations do annual conference calls or an annual update to all their donors in times when we can see each other face to face. One organization that I consult with had this great, all of their donors, they would have this annual meeting where the executive director would present and they'd celebrate their accomplishments and all that kind of stuff. And so that's the types of engagement. You want to report back, tell them you donated this much, and because this campaign raised this much, we were able to do these things, that kind of thing. So you're reporting back, you're continuing to engage your donor. And then ideally that leads to more committed relationships, right? So that's where you can upgrade the donor. That's where you can take somebody from a one-time donor to a repeat donor. That's where somebody who's been giving once a year, 2 or 3 years, can become a monthly donor. So, or somebody who's been giving at lower levels, you learn more about them, you see that they have capacity to give bigger gifts, and you ask them to become a major donor. So that's kind of the pipeline that I like to think about when I'm thinking about engaging my donors. And that's where transactional can be, that identify and solicit stage is an event, right? But without the stewardship and they've said yes, they've come to your event, now inspire them and build that affinity after that event. I also like to say donors that are really engaged, that's where you can also leverage peer-to-peer fundraising, which is one of my favorite types of fundraising, because you get your donors to fundraise for you, and they make it easier because your donors are out there saying, I love this organization and you should too. So they're doing a lot of that cultivation work for you, which is great. So you start at the solicit stage, they make a donation to you, and then you just have to steward them well. But you can't do peer-to-peer well if you don't have those really committed donors who are going to go to bat for you, who are going to ask their friends on your behalf. So, so that's the big transition. And I think the hardest thing for organizations to make that transition, that pivot that I've seen is, but we've always done it this way. And I come into organizations as a consultant and say, well, okay, but if it's not working, why? Or if it's holding you back, why? There is nothing written that says just because you've done a gala for 5 years that you have to do it longer, right? If it isn't working, if it's not getting that return on investment, if you need to pull back from an event so that you can invest the resources into relationship-based fundraising, because it does require significant resources and relationship building. That's a lot of staff time. But to make that pivot, you've got to look at what isn't working within your organization. And sometimes that means letting go of things that you've done in the past. So there is that mentality shift that is really, really key in moving an organization from transaction-based fundraising to relationship-based fundraising.
Excellent. And you know what? That letting go is often so very hard, isn't it? It really is. So Jenny, just to kind of carry on that conversation about the importance of donor cultivation and stewardship.
Yes.
How important is it, and can you share some lessons learned?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So adding on to what Kelly was saying about cultivation, how important that is. When I teach my students about donor cultivation and stewardship, we talk about the cultivation cycle. So you're doing your research. So you're doing your research to find those ideal donors. And typically what you're trying to do is find donors that are like donors you already have. And so you know that certain personas, if there's a donor persona that you're looking at. And so you want to find those like-minded donors as well. So you do your research, and then you do your prospecting, and then you do more research, and then you do the qualifying, and then you do more research, and then you do the solicitation, and so on. And so it's rinse and repeat to make sure that you are following or bringing that donor through that cultivation cycle. And then once you have that donor, the stewardship begins the moment after you receive the gift. Not before, because you're still cultivating and using, you know, Kelly's marriage analogy, I absolutely love, because I mean, that's what it is, right? So you are wooing your donors to come to you. And once they've accepted that marriage proposal, now you can start that stewardship process. And what I find really important with stewardship is that a lot of donors and a lot of nonprofit organizations forget about two important words: thank you. Mm-hmm. One lesson learned that I want to share with you is when I was working at the Cancer Society, our major gifts lady was in charge of soliciting or looking for major gift donors, and a donation came in. It was a $50,000 donation. And typically what she would do is she would go into Razor's Edge, which is a fundraising database. She would go into Razor's Edge and she would look at the research, and so would find out the donor history. You know, how much have they given in the past? What amounts have they been given? So that she can say, you know, Mr. Smith, you know, in the 5 years that you've been a donor with us, you've raised, you know, over $100,000. You know, we're so happy for your donation, et cetera, et cetera. However, this particular moment when she received the $50,000 donation, she called up the member, or the donor, I should say, and thanked them for their donation. Thank you, Mr. Smith, that your $50,000 donation is so generous. I can't believe that you would donate to us, and I'm so grateful for your support, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a pause, and Mr. Smith said to her, I've been donating for the last 10 years. And this is the first phone call, the first acknowledgement of my donation. So that was a huge lesson learned for our major gifts lady. And this is a nice segue into what I think is important for all organizations, not just nonprofit organizations, but I think all organizations in general, is to create a thank you plan. So how soon after you receive the donation do you send out the thank you? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? Is it a letter? it depends on the level of donation. So are you getting a board member to make that call? Is it an executive director? Is it a staff person? Is it a volunteer? And so depending on the amount of donation will determine what sort of thank you is given. So is it a phone call thank you followed up by a letter? Are you keeping track of weddings, wedding anniversaries, birthdays, special occasions? What kind of relationship do you have with your donor? Back to what Kelly was alluding to as well, is that the relationship. And so you're building that relationship. And I also want to talk about when it comes to stewardship. I know that it's been mentioned about not so much it's the impact of the donation, which is also very important. But you also have to understand that there is a donor bill of rights. So if a donor is saying, here's my donation, I want this donation to go specifically to a particular area. So for instance, in cancer, I want this donation to go to breast cancer research. I want it to go to pediatric research. I want it to go, and they expect that their donation is going to go to that particular section of the research, and they want reports. So tell them what their money is being used for. Give them the impact of their donation. Tell them what the progress is. Keep them informed, and thank them again and again and again. Because the more you thank them, and what you're doing is you're retaining those donors. You're increasing their value, and you're then easing them through, again, that whole cultivation process, right? So it could be someone who maybe is a one-time donor, maybe they're donating $25 a month. Now all of a sudden they're up to $50, maybe $100 a month. Maybe now they're becoming major donors. Mm-hmm. And so you have to think about the importance of that stewardship process. It cannot be taken for granted. And every single person who is working in your nonprofit organization has to understand the importance of that donor value, that relationship, and that it's their job, it's their mission to convey and relay that to their donors.
That appreciation. Well, yeah, that's absolutely a perfect segue, Jenny. Thank you for that, because that's a great segue to our next question or point of conversation with Kelly related to the ask. So we talked, Kelly talked about the ask to begin with. You've touched on something, Jenny, that like when is it time to make the ask for something more, or the next to become to continue on in that pipeline. So Kelly, can you talk about that? People find it difficult to talk about money and ask for money. Do you have some tips to help organizations?
For sure. So first and foremost, I tell people it's a good idea, especially if you're getting into fundraising for the first time, or you're new to fundraising, or you're an executive director and you've got to get more involved with fundraising. First and foremost, I really advise people to assess your own relationship with money and talk about how you feel about money. It's actually, this is a strategy I learned from Laura Friedrich. She wrote a wonderful book called The Ask. So I advise everybody to read it. It's a great book. I actually got to work with Laura over a weekend. She was at a conference that I went to, and I got to hang out with her for a weekend, and she was absolutely wonderful. And so I really advise people read her book. But to be a successful asker, you really need to excavate your own relationship with money. So something I do with a lot of my clients is this free association activity where we write down all of the thoughts that come into their minds as when I say the word money, and I just keep saying money to them, and we come up with quite a list. But the main things I hear that are problematic are debt, and power. And so people really struggle with that. I think that's really at the heart of why we struggle with asking, because if you accept money from someone, there's this mentality that we owe them or they have power over us, and that feels uncomfortable and it feels a little icky. And most of these clients are in the United States, so this might be a cultural thing. But also I just see that over and over again. So when if you're doing relationship-based fundraising for real, people are giving to you because they love your work. And so that's something that's the mentality shift, is you don't owe them anything. They love your cause. They're giving to your cause because you are making the change they want to see. And so you are a conduit to achieving their dreams, right? And so if you can see fundraising as and asking as you're giving somebody an opportunity to change the world, that's a very different mentality than, ooh, they're going to give me money and then I owe them something and there's this power dynamic, and all of that feels really, really icky. But if you can change your mentality to, I'm giving this person a chance to change the world, and that is powerful. That is empowering. That should feel really, really good. I know that's what fuels my career. Is that's what I think about. Is I'm giving people the opportunity to change the world, and that's much more empowering. So that's your own mentality set, right? That's my first tip for how you change your own mentality. My second thing is, if you're not sure a donor is going to be appreciate being asked, or that the likelihood of them saying no is pretty high, you might be asking too soon in the relationship. You might not have cultivated enough. Certainly somebody like me who's been in this for 12 years, I can really tell, I can judge. I've got a gut at this point of like, ugh, I don't think we've done enough. I think we need to do a few more cultivation steps before we ask. But I think that's, if you can get over your own roadblocks, then that gut turns on, and you can kind of tell, okay, this might, I don't know, I want to call Jane and ask her for some money, but I don't know how she's going to respond. If you're not sure how they're going to respond, it might be too soon in the relationship, especially if you're doing one-on-one fundraising. And then the last thing for ask, this is more of a technical how to ask question tip, but I see a lot of nonprofits that think they're asking that are not asking. An ask ends in a question mark. It's a question, right? I see a lot of things like, your contribution today makes a difference. That's a statement. That is not a question. So I want donors, when they see an ask, they have to silently answer in their own mind. If I say your contribution today makes a difference, you do not have to come up with an answer. You're just reading text, right? If I say, can you make a gift today? You have to answer that. If you're reading it, if you're hearing it, wherever you receive that statement, you do have to silently answer it. And so that, make sure it's a question first and foremost. But in the nonprofit world, we talk a lot about SMART goals. I hope everybody's familiar with that term. If not, SMART stands for, they need to be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. There's tons of stuff online. You can just Google that, SMART goals. I think we've got to learn how to make smart asks. So leveraging those words and thinking about, does that apply to the ask? So instead of, can you make a gift today? Say, can you make a gift of $50 to help feed families in Manitoba today? That's a very powerful, very specific ask. There is no doubt in my donor's mind what I am asking for and why. And so the more you can make smart asks, the more powerful those asks are and the easier they are to answer for your donor. So I think those are my top three ask tips.
Great tips for asking. Jenny, I saw you leaning in a couple of times. Do you have something to add to that? Or
I do, absolutely, I do. And I love what Kelly was saying about the ask, because she's right. We think we're making the ask, but we're not really making the ask, and then we're surprised when there's no money coming in. But when it comes to the ask, a lot of times, and it comes to having a conversation with someone, because if we're having a conversation and if I don't say something right away, it's like, oh, you know what, I can't have that awkward silence, so I have to jump in, I have to say something. And so when you're making that ask, make the ask and then sit back and wait. And don't rush it, because the person that you've made the ask to, they could be thinking in their mind, okay, so, you know, do I go for a 3-year commitment? Is it a 1 year? How much money? So they're having this intrapersonal conversation with themselves, thinking about You know, is it too soon? Is it too much? Should I give more? And if you start jumping in and pressuring them, they're going to like, okay, wait a minute. So now it's like, okay, I'm being pressured. I'm going to back off. And so you've lost that opportunity. So it's important to, when you make the ask, just be quiet and give them a chance to think about what it is that they want to do. And the answer might be, well, I'd love to donate or I'd like to contribute. Not now is an opportunity. So it's not a no, it's a not now. So then you can have another conversation about, okay, so when can we connect? You know, because of COVID, maybe the timing isn't right. I don't, you know, money's tight. Let's make it, let's make a date. I will follow up with you in March 2021 or whatever that is. And so you haven't lost that donation or that donor. It's just maybe not yet.
Great. Perfect. I have a final question for Jenny, and it's related to what organizations should consider regarding data management and tracking.
Yes.
So lots of organizations lack financial and human resources to dedicate to fund development. And we did have a few suggestions that have been shared already this morning. And so do you have anything to add to that? I know, yeah, so I'll just leave that with you.
Okay, thanks, Leanne. Absolutely. The importance of dirty data. I just want to share something with you. So for every 100 new donors you acquire, you lose 107 due to attrition. Okay, so for every 100 you gain, you're losing 107. And so what can you do to stop that trend? Now, when it comes to attrition, there's a variety of reasons. You know, people die, people move away, their capacity for giving has changed. You know, their financial circumstances are not what they used to be. And so donors will leave your organization for a variety of reasons, which may or may not have anything to do with anything that you have done. However, dirty data can cost you, not just in terms of money, but it can also cost you in terms of relationships. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of relationships. Okay, so things like mailing to bad addresses, incorrect personalization. Now you can see on the screen, my name is spelled with a G, which is short for Genevieve. If you send me something to Jennifer or to Jenny with a J, I'm going to know that you're not paying attention to who I am. So incorrect personalization, Mrs. versus Mr., you know, dear sir, madam, which I think should be done away with completely forever and ever and ever. Mailing to deceased members. I remember when I was working for the Cancer Society, I got a phone call from a member. Her husband had been dead for 4 years and he was still getting mail addressed to him, and he had been deceased for 4 years. And she said, every year I call and I say, can you please update your database, remove my husband's name from your database? Did not happen. So what are the chances that she will continue to donate to your organization? Ignoring do not mail. Okay, privacy. I don't want to receive any mail from you. And if I receive mail from you, guess what? You can just remove me from your database forever because you're not paying attention. So when it comes to dirty data and tracking, here's the things that you need to do. You need to audit your database. Now I know smaller organizations, you may not have the staff component to do that, but that's where you can get volunteers to come in. So what you're doing is you're auditing your database and you're doing a cleanup. You're removing those duplicate addresses. I remember receiving 4 different solicitation letters, and each one had my address slightly different, even though I received it, my name slightly different. So I'm looking at this thinking, okay, so I received 4 different solicitation letters from you, and if you can't manage that small component, what else are you doing that I should be worried about? So the other one is that you have to establish systems and processes. Now, small or large organizations, you can do this from the get-go. This is the system that we're using going forward, and everybody has to be on board with this. Make sure that everyone knows that every piece of data has a monetary value and a donor love value. Okay, so we have to show our donors that we love them. And by showing them that we love them means that we care about what we're sending them. Now, other things that you can do to repercussions of poor tracking and dirty data is eliminate manual and repetitive tasks. If you are using Excel spreadsheet to keep track of your database and your donors, I've done it. And it's just so labor intensive, and it just hurts me to think that this is what some organizations are still using. So find a system, and I know that you know, Brody talked about the different ways of different, and Andrew also mentioned a couple of different software tools that you can use. You want to also reduce the confusion and coordination between staff. So back to Kelly, what Kelly was saying about the ask. So if you haven't done your research about your donor and what their capacity is, so if one staff is going out and they're saying, oh, can you donate $500 for our special event? But meanwhile, another staff member is talking about a major gift and they're asking them for $5,000. So the donor is going to say, but I already gave you $500. So our policy is that we only give once to an organization. So now that $5,000 possible donation is now gone because now you've got $500. So you have to make sure that your staff are talking to each other, that you're coordinating that information. And the last tip I want to offer is make sure you have everything organized. Know where everything is. Again, back to those processes, having those in place, knowing that if you are going to be going out for solicitation, check with your team. Hey, does anybody have any information about this particular donor? I'm thinking of asking them this. Get together, talk to each other. You know, everybody is so busy in their own little silos, in their own little projects, that we forget that we can talk to each other. We can ask questions. Hey, Kelly, I remember that you were dealing with this particular company last year. Can you give me some insight on what I should do to talk to them? And so then you're sharing information, because your common goal is, again, you're all working for the same team. You're all working for the same organization. And so you want to make sure that you are following best practices. And again, if you don't have the staff resources, you have volunteers that are eager and anxious and willing to work with you. Students who need that, you know, for high school, they need those hours, right?
Right.
Get some students in to do some database management for you, do some data entry, etc. It's really good training for them, and it's a win-win for everybody.
Those are some excellent points, Jenny. And I think that, you know, not working in silos is something that many small nonprofits sometimes have challenges with, just because they're so busy, as you said. But everybody has a piece of the pie when it comes to their partners, because, you know, often program partners are also donors. I would imagine that that's pretty important too, if you have national organizations as well as provincial or local, is having that conversation and coordination between. Okay. Yeah. So at this point, I want to invite Andrew to come back and just remind you, everyone in the audience, to put your questions in, to share any questions that you might have. I just need to pop mine out here.
We do have some questions. Kelly, can you tell us about the calls that board members can make and what they would say or ask? This individual is curious to learn how others can do that for the organization.
For sure. I love doing thank you calls as a way to get board members engaged in fundraising. I found that it's something that board members actually like. If you force board members to start asking for you, it's a high hurdle, right? Like they're really nervous. But thank you calls is something that people are like, oh, I just call and say thank you. Yeah, I can handle that. But then once they start hearing from donors, it almost cultivates your board members for you in an interesting way, that they're hearing from donors. Oh, I love this organization because of this thing that they did changed my life. This, like, I give this much, I wish I could give more. Those types of things that board members hear helps board members. Then I've seen that be a great catalyst for board members to come back and say, wow, that was incredible. Your donors really love you. I could do more in fundraising, because they get those nice warm fuzzies. So the first thing I always have board members do is just a round of thank you calls. So often, I mean, we're about to come up on a great point for thank you calls after year end. I like to say, like, let things simmer down. But the second or third week in January, get a list of everybody who donated to your year-end campaign and assign calls out to your board members. Functionally, practically, how to do that is I will often make a script and I will make everybody their own spreadsheet that has the donor's name, their phone number, and what they donated to the year-end campaign. And then I have a column for notes from the call. And so I'll talk all my board members through the script. I'll talk them through the chart and what updates I need on the spreadsheet. And then I'll give them 2 weeks to make those calls, and I'll send them reminders because they won't do it unless you remind them. But I'll send, you know, once or twice a week reminders like, hey, how are the calls going? Do you have any questions at this point? Things like that. And one, it's a great way to steward your board and get them more engaged in fundraising. It's a great thank you stewardship step for your donors. And it's also, you get very valuable data from that because your board members are calling and talking to your donors and they're saying, oh, Susie gave because this thing your organization did. That's really valuable information for you as a fundraiser. So make sure there's also the report back mechanism. And I always, speaking of volunteers, as Jenny said, using volunteers to make sure your data is good. I always have a volunteer lined up on the due date that the board members are supposed to give me their spreadsheets back with somebody who's going to go in and put that information into our donor database to make sure that that next time I go to call that donor to make a solicitation or something, I see whatever notes I've gotten from the board member. But thank you calls especially are very, very easy. It's, hi, so-and-so. I always like to start with, do you have a minute to talk to me? Because if they're in the middle of something else, they're not going to appreciate the phone call. It's going to be frustrating. So I just say, hi, this is Kelly. I'm calling from whatever organization. Do you have a minute to talk to me? And then if they say yes, okay, great. I just wanted to call and say thank you so much for your donation. I'm just wondering, like, what inspired you to give? Things like that really help donors connect with your organization. And like I said, if you're having board members do these calls, it's really great because they kind of cultivate each other, which is nice.
That's awesome. Thank you, Kelly. And that actually, I think, responds to the next question that we had regarding how do you get volunteers involved. So does anyone have anything additional to add to that? How to engage volunteers?
One thing that we do at the Dream Factory is, depending on your mission, try to have volunteers are amazing, but if you have volunteers that are connected to the services that you provide and they're willing to become involved. At the Dream Factory, we have what we call gratitude ambassadors, but they're actually grandparents of our dream kids that make all of our thank you calls. And it just kind of takes it one extra step in making people feel connected to what they're doing. And donors, I think, in our situation will often be more honest about their involvement and how they feel about the organization with the volunteers than they would necessarily with me or one of our board members. It's less intimidating, I think.
And I think another way that you can get volunteers to get involved is have friends ask friends. So if someone is involved in fundraising or not fundraising, but volunteering for an event, such as a run or doing that peer-to-peer or whatever it is, get their friends involved. Like, hey, you guys, I'm doing there's a street cleanup, or there's a this going on, and who wants to be involved with me? So there's there's the Habitat for Humanity, they have the builds, there's the Winnipeg Harvest, you know, there's soup kitchens, there's lots of things that you can get friends together. And when friends are doing it together, it's something that, you know, you've got that bonding experience. Asking kids, and again, back to students who are volunteering to do some data entry, get them to do other things as well. Church organizations, sports organizations, there's a lot of really good areas that you can get volunteers to be involved. Also corporations, you know, there's the corporate philanthropy part of it, where corporations will encourage their staff to volunteer. I used to work for a bank where part of our performance review is that I had to prove and show proof that I volunteered for 3 different organizations. And so that was part of my performance review, is that I had to show that there was that corporate social responsibility, that my engagement with the community was apparent.
Yeah,
excellent. Those are good.
I would add on to Jenny that peer-to-peer fundraising is great. I will caveat having donors in your, or having volunteers in your database. I usually have them sign a non-disclosure agreement with the organization because they're dealing with sensitive data that should not be shared outside your organization. So it's something that I do it less because I'm worried that my donors are going to run around and hand out our data, but more to impress upon them, like, this is confidential, especially organizations that work in small communities where maybe you're going to see like, oh, so-and-so gave them all that money. Like, it's a way to just make sure they're clear on, you know, this is sensitive, you are not to disclose this. Just a way to make sure they're understanding that. Also, only use volunteers you really, really trust to get it right, because I've also seen it go very awry where a volunteer gets in the donor database and blows things up. And so, so I would say also be cautious about which volunteers you let into your donor database and what you give them access to within your database. A lot of database softwares let you say, like, they can see addresses because that's what they're cleaning, but they can't see donation amounts. So be clear on what how your database allows you to customize that, and only give them access to what they absolutely need to see.
Excellent, excellent tips. Gratitude ambassadors is fabulous. That's a great, you know, it's a great role for folks that are very engaged and invested in those types of situations, and yet maybe don't know exactly what else they can do. So those are all fabulous. Thank you. I think it's time for us to kind of wrap up, but I want to give you each a chance to tell us if number one thing organizations could do or implement now, like hanging up from this event or listening to the event afterwards. What can they do now to make a difference within their fund development strategy longer term? So Andrew, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I think the 2 things from my little presentation I'd want people to take away are, if you have donors that are interested in helping out in some way, that's enough. And you can figure out from there what that looks like. And that's really kind of fertile ground for doing something really creative together. So whether it's totally outside what you would normally do, or it's not part of a specific third-party kit or a thing that you have, go with them to see what they would be most interested in doing and if there's an opportunity to fundraise around that. And the second thing is just to think creatively about what the story of your organization is. If your organization was to take over the front page of your local newspaper, what would that look like? And use that to kind of inform some of your storytelling moving forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Jenny, one thing that a group could do, or 2 things.
Two things, please. Thank you. The first thing, the first thing that I want organizations to think about is, what is your why? Why are you doing this? And so I think about Simon Sinek, who he created the golden circle. So in the middle is why, which is your mission. Then the how is your values, and the what is your vision. So with the Cancer Society, if our mission is the eradication of cancer and the support of families living with cancer, That is mission driven. So understand what your mission is and make sure that everyone understands that. And this leads into the second thing that I think is very important, and not just for nonprofits, but I almost want to say especially for nonprofits. Make sure you have a culture of philanthropy. Now, what does that mean? Culture of philanthropy. The idea is that every single person who is involved in your organization, so that is the board of directors, that is your staff, that is your executive director, that is your volunteers, that is even suppliers that you're working with, okay? They have to understand that there's a culture of philanthropy. Nonprofit work is not a 9-to-5 job. It's long hours, it's hard work. You have a lack of resources, not just the bodies, but the money. Your pay is less than most organizations. And so you have to ask yourself, why do you work? Why did I work for a nonprofit organization for 10 years? And my answer is because I'm making a difference. And when you get that impact report, or you get somebody to say, thank you so much for all that you've done, that solidifies my reasons for wanting to be involved with a nonprofit. And so you want to make sure that every single person who's involved in your organization, in your nonprofit organization, understands why they are there, that they're supporting the mission, and that everyone it's their role to make a difference in their donor's life, in people who are involved with the organization. That's what keeps nonprofits going.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Kelly, your last pieces of advice.
I would say we've presented a ton of different things you can do to get better at fundraising and fund development. I would say my one piece of advice is pick one thing you can start working on and do that. And then when you figure that out, when you think you've got a handle on it, then pick the next thing. Don't try and implement it all at the same time. This is where having clear priorities is really important, because priorities mean you aren't chasing the newest, flashiest, latest thing that you've learned and trying to implement that along with all the other things you're trying to do. Setting clear priorities means you've assessed where your opportunities lie, you kind of outline them, and you can focus on just one thing. So priorities mean you can focus on what matters and you know what doesn't matter. So I think that's the most critical thing. If, for example, if social media isn't something you feel like your organization has a handle on, but you're doing email pretty well and there's just some things you need to do to take that up to the next level, as we learned from Brady, social significantly less than important than a lot of people think, which is generally what I say in my consulting as well. But then get better at email. If that's where your focus needs to be, focus on that. Don't try and figure out peer-to-peer and social and Facebook ads and all of these things all at the same time. Get really good at one thing and then move on to the next thing. And so that's as I like to say, I used to be a fitness coach. I would never tell a client who's never run a day in their life to sign up for a marathon, right? I would never ever do that. I would say, oh, start with a couch to 5K, give it a try, try running 1 minute out of every 5 on your next walk, something like that, right? But somehow we think we can muscle through in other areas of our lives. So I think just focus on one thing and the next step and the next thing you can get really good at, rather than trying to bite off 20 different things at the same time.
Excellent. I hardly even know how to wrap this up, but I would just say on behalf of Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, thank you and all the people that we've had join for participating in the Fund Development Leader Panel. You've inspired us to think about our current practices and what we can do differently in the future. Related to storytelling, partnerships, multi-channel approaches, data management, and just so much more. So organizations can build these tactics into their fund development plans, and I know that people will go away having at least one of those things that they can do, or 100 different things, but we'll choose one. I will turn it over to Leanne Tibbetts.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have certainly appreciated the panel discussion. And we are going to give you folks in the audience an opportunity just to tell us what you think. And we're going to launch a poll here quickly. And we would ask for you to respond to the polling questions that are posed as they are made available on your screen.
Okay, so was the information useful to you and your organization? You can select one and submit your answer. If you're having a challenge submitting your answer, you can also type it in the questions tab, and it shouldn't affect too terribly much. We have about 74% of the votes in. If you want to give it a couple more seconds. And I will close and launch the results. So the results show as 44% surpassed expectations, 44% very useful, 12% useful, and 0% not useful. Okay. So Leanne, would you like me to launch the next one?
Absolutely, please do so.
So the next poll was the length. Please select one, too long, just right, or too short. Everyone's voting very fast on this one. That's great. So I'll leave this open for a couple more seconds. Okay, and I'll share the results. So 30% said too long and 70% said just right and 0% said too short. So that's great. And the last poll is, what topics should we cover next? Please select all that apply. You can select more than one here. Annual general meetings, risk management and the board, change management, financial management and reading financial statements, transdisciplinary, fluid skills, communication, leadership. All right, so you can select more than one on this poll. And getting up there around 70%. Give it a couple more seconds. Okay, and the results. What topics should we cover next? 43% annual general meetings, 57% risk management and the board, 57% change management, 57% financial management and reading financial statements, and 65% transdisciplinary fluid skills. All right, so you have the screen, Leanne Tibbetts.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That helps us to gather information and that will influence future sessions that we are going to offer virtually. So thank you for being honest and sharing that with us. So it's been a very busy morning, and I would like to say thank you so much to our presenters that have taken the time to be with us today. We hope that you have enjoyed this Learn and Lead seminar hosted by Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. We trust that everyone will be leaving with new ideas, new resources, and a commitment to try new approaches within your organization. If you are looking for other governance or leadership information, do visit our website at gov.mb.ca/agriculture and click on Industry Leadership. Our team is available to assist agriculture organizations to respond to your governance and leadership questions, and you can contact us at leadership@gov.mb.ca. Following today's session, you will receive an email and we will share with you a copy of the recording, as well as the PowerPoint slides that were shared, a link to our website, and a number of other valuable resources that you might find useful within your organization. So thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.